We will be doing the timing. So if you're speaking, look over here and you'll see a sign when you have 10 minutes left, 5 minutes left, etc. What have I missed? That's everything. I think that's everything. So Emiliano's going to sort out the first set of slides.
Yeah, let's kick off with Basha. There you go.
I forgot one thing. We're doing questions throughout.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bipasha Maiti. I am an assistant professor of economics at Ashoka University, which is in India. And I'm going to talk about female legislators and forest conservation in India. And this paper is co-authored with Shrutita Bandyopadhyay, who is at the Indian Institute of Management, and Pranavesh Datta and Naveen Hari, who are PhD students at CUNY and Texas A&M. So one of the motivations that for this particular study is something that we came across from the World Value Surveys, where this question was asked: do you agree that environmental protection should be prioritized even if it costs economic growth? And a larger proportion of women in India seem to agree with this statement relative to that of men. But of course, these are women, usual women and men, not politicians, okay? Now, if you go back to the economics literature, a lot of studies have demonstrated the adverse effects of climate events like extreme heat shocks, droughts and so on. And it's kind of demonstrated that these things have a larger adverse impacts on women and children. So these are adverse impacts for women and children. Do we kind of expect female politicians to be therefore more responsive to these kinds of issues? So if we keep, look back to the citizen candidate model, then it kind of suggests that yes, female politicians should be kind of representing the preferences of women in general, and particularly with regard to issues affecting women and children. Now, a recent cross-country study also actually kind of points to that direction. So it suggests that women parliamentarians are actually more likely to enact policies which promote environmental protection. Now, in the context of India, a recent study by Bhaskar and Balhotra and others actually show that women politicians are more likely to promote economic growth. Now, if you think economic growth to be at loggerheads with environmental protection, that raises an interesting dilemma. What about environmental protection, right? Given the kind of context that we've kind of stated. So that brings us to our key research question, which is: do female politicians promote forest cover growth in their constituencies? And in studying female politicians, we look at, of course, all constituencies, but we also look at politicians who come from historically marginalized communities in India, who we will call the scheduled castes, the SCs, and the scheduled tribes, the STs. And notice that in some of these constituencies where there is mandated representation of individuals from these marginalized communities, only individuals from those communities can run for office, but anybody can kind of vote for them. So we will look at politicians in general, but also politicians in those constituencies. And we try to give, conduct a causal analysis by exploiting the regression discontinuity design framework. So our research question can raise a bunch of other questions. So you might ask, why do you focus on forests, for example? Well, something that's kind of already known to this audience. We know that forests have been considered as a major carbon sink, refer back to the Kyoto Protocol and so on. A number of studies in economics have also pointed out to the health and productivity benefits of forests. And in the context of developing countries, forests also seem to be something that people depend on with regard to their livelihoods. So all of these reasons point to the fact that preservation of forests is of great policy relevance. Now, another thing that you might ask is, what other set of politicians, elected representatives, are you really focusing on? For many of us who are familiar with the governance structure in India, we have the national kind of parliament, right, on top. Then you have the state legislatures, and then you have the local level bodies, right, the municipalities and the village councils. So here we're actually looking at politicians who are elected in these provincial governments and state legislatures, okay? And so the election is a usual first past the post system, takes place in general once every 5 years. Now, the reason, again, why we focus on these state legislatures is the following: that for a long period of time, forests belong to what is called the state list of the Indian Constitution. So that effectively means that state governments were the ones who had sort of the prerogative of enacting policies for promoting forest conservation. Forests have since then moved into the concurrent list of the Indian Constitution, which means that both the national parliament, so the national government, as well as the state legislatures can enact policies for promoting forest conservation. Now, having said that, a lot of qualitative evidence also points to the fact that a lot of these discussions on forest conservation or environmental protection is kind of much more concentrated among state government or assembly legislators rather than parliamentarians. So that's really one of the chief reasons we focus on looking at state government elections. In terms of the contribution to the literature, there's already a large body of literature that looks at the impact of politician gender on a range of different development outcomes. So environment is something that has remained relatively understudied, so we try to add to the literature in that regard. In general, there's one exception, however, in regard to these studies, which is this study by Jagnani and Mahadevan, who actually show that female legislators elected to these state governments actually are committed to lowering air pollution by curbing crop residue burning. But strategies that are really aimed at combating climate change through forest conservation likely to be somewhat distinct than policies that aim at curbing air pollution, right? Because of the nature of externalities they're likely to generate, right? So it's kind of interesting to look at both these outcomes, right? So the data that we kind of...
I had a question on the previous slide. So in the paper, the Jagnani and Mahadevan, what was the outcome?
So they look at emissions, particulate emissions. Yeah. So the data source is the Shrub platform of Usher, Novosad, and co-authors. So many of us may be again familiar with it. It provides data on a rich set of outcomes, socioeconomic, demographic, political, and environment at very fine geographical levels. So towns or villages, or for our purpose, assembly constituencies. And these geographic units are also consistent over time. So what we do is that we combine the data on these political variables with the data on forest cover. So forest cover data generated through satellite imagery and thermal signatures. So the period of time we ultimately end up studying is 2000 to 2014. So the chief outcome variable that we kind of look at is the year-to-year growth in forest cover. Alternatively, we also look at forest cover growth over the entire electoral term of a politician. So in terms of empirical strategy, what we know is that if we compare constituencies where female politicians have won to those in which male politicians have won, they may not generate credible causal estimates. This is largely because there could be a lot of unobservable differences between these constituencies. So maybe constituencies which are pro-environment to start with, right? If they believe that female politicians are also more likely to invest in environmental protection, they may actually end up electing those kinds of politicians. So to circumvent the kind of problem, we use a typical regression discontinuity design setup. So this is our sharp RD equation. So the GYIST is basically the growth cover. Growth in the forest cover in this assembly constituency. So for example, you take the log of the proportion of an assembly constituency, which is under forests in the period T, minus the log of the proportion of the constituency, which is under forest in the period T minus 1. So that kind of measures the year-to-year growth. So margin is essentially our running variable over here. So that is basically the difference in the vote percentage of the female politicians and the male politicians. So if margin, for example, is positive, then it means that a female politician has won. And so the treatment variable T in that case is going to take the value of 1. On the other hand, if margin is negative, then it means that a male politician has won. And so the treatment variable T is then going to take the value of 0. We also cluster the standard errors at the level of the assembly constituencies. So more formally, what we're essentially doing is that we're comparing constituencies where a female politician has won to constituencies where a male politician has won in a neighborhood H around the cutoff, okay, which is 0. And this particular neighborhood or the bandwidth is chosen in a data-driven optimal approach as suggested by Cataneo, Kalannikov, and so on. And we do allow for differences in slopes on either sides of the cutoff. So again, just to kind of reiterate, we are kind of looking at elections in which male and female politicians are running, in which they kind of occupy first and second positions. So these are elections which we are going to call mixed gender elections. And during our study period, we actually see that whether we look at all constituencies or we look at exclusively the SC/ST reserved constituencies, we do see the prevalence of these kinds of elections. So here I'm presenting the results on the year-to-year growth, and I want you to focus on panel A over here. So what it kind of tells us is that overall, electing a female politician seems to have positive impact on the growth of forest cover, but this result only seems to be statistically significant for those constituencies in which are reserved for the historically marginalized communities, the SCs and STs over here. We can choose different algorithm for the optimal bandwidth, and we get somewhat similar results. So this is essentially the graphical representation of what was there in the table. This is for the sample of all constituencies, and this is for the sample of SC/ST reserved constituencies. So we also try to test whether there is any bit of heterogeneity influencing these results. So in other words, what are these constituencies, right, for which these results seem to be kind of important? So are these constituencies which were already densely forested to start with, so greater than the 75th percentile of the distribution of forest cover, or are these constituencies which are kind of, let's say, below the 75th percentile of forest cover? And actually we see that many of these results are actually completely driven by constituencies which were not sort of densely forested to kind of start with at the beginning of the study period. So we kind of undertake a bunch of usual kind of validity tests with regard to RD. So firstly, we kind of check for any possibility of manipulation at the victory margin, the standard Macquarie density tests. And what we kind of see over here is that there does not appear to be indication of manipulation at the victory margin, either for the sample of all constituencies or for the SC/ST reserved constituencies. And in this regard, these results kind of resonate with what a number of studies in the existing literature has found.
If we leave aside the SC/ST, what would be the general theory that would suggest that having a female politician would reduce forest loss? Why would that? What's the theory as to why female politicians?
So we try to probe into certain potential mechanisms behind that. So it could be potential differences in preferences. And there's also certain age effects coming in where female politicians are in general younger than male politicians. So I will kind of delve into some of that a little bit later.
Is the SC/ST result possibly because they make more use of the forest?
That is certainly a possibility that they make most use of the forests. But again, it's really driven by the female SC/ST politicians. So we kind of try to probe into, let's say, differences in preferences, but also differences in the perception of the constraints these communities can face if, let's say, forest cover disappears. So I will kind of try to delve into those things as well. So again, in terms of the validity checks, other standard sort of validity checks involve testing for covariate continuity. So we kind of look at three sets of variables. So we look at a bunch of predetermined candidate constituency level variables. So, past, for example, electorate size or turnout percentage, incumbency of politicians and so on in the past election. And we do not see any discontinuities at the margin of victory cutoff. We also look at certain predetermined constituency level characteristics demographics. So which could kind of point towards whether constituencies are likely to be a little bit pro-woman. So for example, the percentage of, women who are literate, percentage of women in the workforce and so on in the past. And none of those things also seem to be discontinuous at the cutoff of the margin of victory. We also test for certain candidate constituencies in the candidate characteristics, beg your pardon, in the current election. So for example, we look at whether candidates have more assets, whether they are kind of, in terms of their age distribution, how do they look like, the kind of criminal cases which are kind of registered against them, as well as their educational levels. What we find is that for the sample of SC/ST constituencies, these things are completely balanced. In other words, there appears to be no sort of discontinuities in these covariates. But for the sample of all constituencies, we find that female politicians, one stark difference that kind of emerges is that female politicians are somewhat younger than their male counterparts. So we kind of hold on to that thought, and we'll return to that sometime later. Again, we kind of undertake some additional tests. So we kind of remove certain outliers in terms of the measure of forest cover. We can include certain fixed effects, try alternative bandwidth choices, and the results kind of remain more or less stable. We could also kind of test whether our results are particularly sensitive to certain observations very close to the cutoff, despite the fact that we are estimating local average treatment effects. And we kind of find that, if we kind of remove certain observations closest to the cutoff, our results still kind of remain largely stable. So that's the kind of the donut hole test. We can use placebo cutoffs and we should not expect any results over there. And that's exactly what we find. So let us talk about now the growth of the forest cover throughout a candidate's electoral term. So we are looking at the growth at the end of their term, net of their, the findings are essentially, the forest cover at the end of the term, net of the forest cover at the beginning of the term. Now over here, what we actually see is that electing a female politician actually has beneficial effects for all constituencies, particularly stronger for the SC/ST reserved constituencies, but also some effects seems to be creeping up for the sample of all constituencies. So there are two things over here to take note of. You might ask, if we add the point estimates that we got from the year-to-year growth, are we going to arrive at these figures? Well, the answer is somewhat, but not totally, probably because there might be some non-linearities in the way growth accumulates over time. And secondly, what is also kind of important to keep in mind is maybe for the sample of all politicians, we do not see immediate impacts on forest cover growth, but these things might be kind of coming up over time. So these are again similar results, presented graphically for the sample of all constituencies as well as for the sample of SC/ST reserved constituencies. So we try to kind of probe into certain mechanisms as to why these things, why are we kind of seeing these kinds of things. So first, we kind of focus on the year-to-year growth in forest cover. To recap, we find results really for the sample of SC/ST constituencies. So, as I was kind of saying, that these politicians do not appear to be in terms of observables different from each other, these female and male politicians. So that kind of makes us ask the question, what can potentially explain these findings? Unfortunately, our data are not able to provide any additional variables which we could use for testing. So we try to kind of rely a little bit on the existing literature to sort of understand some of these findings. So one thing that could be important is probably there are these differences in preferences between female and male politicians. Another thing could be that a lot of these policy choices may be guided by the differences in the nature of constraints that these politicians can face. So, and there could, of course, be intersection of these issues, both preferences as well as constraints. So if we kind of go back to,
Now, can you see anything about how this is being affected in the sense of, are you seeing already books, or do you think this is stronger enforcement, or is there anything you can observe about how this sort of different trends can manifest?
So that's a very helpful suggestion. I've actually not seen that, partly because I've not been able to figure out data like that, but I should try and probe if there are certain resources that can help me sort of address this. So I can try and see that for sure. Yes.
So yeah, I think we had a question, which is, I'd like to think, I don't know enough about politics in India. I'm so curious about how the legislators make decisions that would affect specifically their constituency, or whether they're sort of part of the state legislature and they decide things together with others.
Yeah.
How they would affect something that we would expect to see specifically in their constituency.
Yeah, so of course, what you said, the latter mechanism is of course true, that legislators get together and overall enact policies like that. So it could be if you have a greater female representation, then women pushing for more environmental protection, you might see more laws that get implemented, but that of course doesn't answer why specifically, let's say, in those constituencies. So again, members of legislative assemblies often have access to certain funds for development in their own constituencies. So I unfortunately, I do not again have the data to kind of tease out how exactly they're using some of these fundings. But broadly overall, that could be another mechanism. And there are a bunch of, examples, again, case by case, not really rigorously established, but which kind of point to the fact that female politicians do end up pushing for, some of these environmental conservation measures in general in their constituencies.
Who owns the actual forest? The state government or the central government?
So it kind of depends, exactly the jurisdiction, but in terms of what kind of policy making can be done, so the Constitution kind of gives powers to both the central and the state government. I know for sure that if the state government is trying to enact certain things which are kind of detrimental to the forest cover, then the national government can kind of step in and stop that. But in general, yes, both of them have.
So you have some land under state government, some.
So it kind of again varies quite a bit, but it seems that I do not know the exact kind of proportion of land going in. Again, we'll want to kind of check that. But yeah, it kind of seems that both these kinds of legislators seem to have visions.
Yeah, I guess related to Robin's earlier question, I wonder if you could look at anything about sort of the party of these politicians and maybe the ethnic groups that come from, but maybe lower level constituencies to see if the key bases of support actually use the forest.
Yeah, so I actually looked at so in the covariant continuity analysis that I was kind of talking about, I looked at politician affiliation by party. So I kind of look at two major national political parties of India, and I do not find any discontinuities in terms of party affiliation, whether you belong to, let's say, the International Congress or the BJP. I could certainly test for other regional parties and see whether something of that sort is kind of going on with regard to party affiliation. But yeah, just looking at major national political parties does not, that doesn't seem to be discontinuous. Sorry?
And their ethnic or like the ethnic identity of the women?
So here we are kind of looking at, individuals who are, so constituencies which are reserved for women who are SCs and STs. So they come from, a certain community for sure, but people who are kind of electing them are all kinds of people, though it's sure that the constituencies in which are kind of reserved for these SC, ST individuals are also constituencies where their population representation is so large.
One of these different mechanisms, I think there's a third mechanism which could just be that women are worse at undertaking activities that promote growth. There could either be preferences that they prefer, they just might be just worse at doing things like, say, getting industry to their area, and that kind of mechanically will lead to more forest cover because deforestation. So I think related to that, it would be useful to look at something like, I guess, nightlife is the best measure, but some measure of economic development or economic growth to get a sense of, is this connected cost to it or is it the second thing, I think just building on what Robin said, I think it would be useful to spend a lot more time thinking of forest policy. So India has a very strange forest policy, kind of going back to after colonial times where they transferred a lot of land to the state, but the state actually prioritized in the beginning kind of industrial development. So villages have very little control over forests. And that's something that I think we've tried to change the new forest policy, but not very successful. We can also distinguish between so-called sort of reserved forests and non-reserved forests and look to see which part is dominant.
Yes.
One of the easiest ways to see the forest opinion is their voting records on policies, particularly environmental laws. You have some report of the votings telling on average and most likely to vote for.
Yeah, so I have information on questions raised, but that's only in the parliament and for a relatively recent period of time, not to the best of my memory, not really the period of time that I'm kind of looking at. And unfortunately, I do not think I have information on let's say question hour kind of questions raised in the state legislatures. I only have it for the parliament, but that would have been kind of again very useful.
Two questions. First, how are you measuring forest regrowth? And then second is do you see the same effect in terms of deforestation, like the opposite? Yeah, so over here, what we're kind of looking at is really the fraction of a constituency which is under forest cover over different periods of time. And so the growth is essentially the log of the forest cover in a period T minus the log of the forest cover in the period T-1.
So that kind of measures the growth in the forest cover. Yeah.
But do you see it in terms of deforestation as well?
So here we kind of do not look at the loss in general. Yeah, we kind of don't look at the loss over here.
So do you think there is something special about forest cover, or is it more a result about climate policies? In the sense that you said that female are more pro climate policies in general, and I think it relates to how this connects with other political, other economic policies like growth policies that are pursued by women.
So over here in this particular paper, so there are multitudes of ways one can think about climate action, right, for combating climate change. So here we kind of look at a specific channel, which is forest. So I kind of do not look at these, other kinds of mechanisms or other kinds of outcomes which would feed to sort of climate change abatement strategies. I look at a particular, outcome as well. Yeah, so to kind of answer you, so here, for example, in this particular paper, we aren't really making the distinction between the two things. We are just looking at, forest conservation as some sort of a proxy for climate change abatement strategy. Yeah. So just to kind of talk about whatever is remaining. So there is some evidence from the experimental literature about women being more patient or altruistic, and that can influence pro-environment behavior. So imagine that you kind of know that you will invest in forests, but those benefits might come up with future generations. They might benefit from that. So if you kind of weigh the welfare of all generations equally, then that can feed into investing in pro-environment policies. But it's also important that these potential behavior differences are also kind of not homogeneous across all women, right? Seem to be much more pertinent for SC/ST women. So a potential reason could be that the kind of constraints that SC/ST individuals face, are particularly much more kind of binding, right? And the kind of adaptation strategies available to them are also very limited. So it's really the perception of these constraints combined with preferences could be a possible mechanism to explain our findings. So in terms of the long-term growth in forest cover, we also find, to just recap, we find results for the sample of all constituencies as well as SC/ST constituencies. So we also try to ask what is really happening to the sample of all constituencies, what might be the reason that's kind of driving the results. So one of the stark things that we kind of find for the sample of all constituencies is that female politicians are on average 6 years kind of younger than their male counterparts. So we try and see, what happens if we kind of divide this sort of politician sample in terms of their ages. Because there's some evidence that younger candidates, invest in reducing deforestation in the context of Brazil. So if we kind of divide politicians by whether you're younger than 6 years, and we call them young politicians, so many of us who are familiar with the demographics of politicians in India, you are really probably young if you're below 60. And if you look at individuals who are greater than or equal to 60, you would see that a lot of these beneficial effects are actually driven by female politicians coming out of the relatively younger sort of age group. So just to kind of wrap up, what these results broadly show is that the gender of the politicians seem to matter for forest conservation. And these results are also similar in spirit to that of Leon, who finds that the gender composition of decision makers in forest management is important for forest conservation. So Leon looks at it in the context of a different country, and Leon does not look at elected representatives, right? So we kind of add to that literature as well. But what is also important finding from this particular study is that the role of caste is also sort of important, right? So there's another identity which is sort of important apart from politician gender. So in this regard, these results are again close in line with the results of Klotz Figueres, who has shown previously that it's not women politicians, but women politicians from these reserved categories who tend to be kind of investing in public goods, potentially because individuals from these communities find it harder to access some of these public goods to start with. Again, it's a relatively topical issue because India does not have any mandated representation for women at the state legislature election or at the national election. Recently, however, the Indian government has enacted a policy that would mandate representation of women at both these levels of elections. And there are also mandated representation of these historically marginalized communities within the broader ambit of women's reservation. So it would be kind of interesting to look at what would be the implications of forest conservation in this sort of a new policy sort of a regime. So I end it over here and have questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you looked at initial differences in opportunity costs of expansion of forest coverage, which maybe even have some political economy effects in terms of lobbying?
Yeah, so I actually try to investigate what kind of information is, let's say, available with regard to these politicians' connections to, some of these industries or, the kind of donations they might be receiving. Unfortunately for India, I could not find this sort of an information. Some information is available on politician occupation, which may probably serve as some sort of a proxy of their connection, but that's kind of available for a later period of time. So, yeah.
What about difference in the initial land values of the land that then later gets deforested, afforested or not?
Yeah, I'll have to look into that, what kind of information is available regarding that. Yeah.
So. Okay, also, for those of you standing, we have a free first row at the front, if you want to. And the next presentation, Eduardo. Oh.
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, so I should talk here for yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitations. Always good to come back to the LSE. So this is ongoing joint work with Juliana Camargo and Gabriel Granjo, who happens to be in London as well. So that's fortunate. So we'll talk together. So this work is about fishing agreements in the Amazon and their impact on deforestation. So it's a pretty standard presentation. We'll go through motivation, theory, methods, and some preliminary results. Right. So we know that deforestation matters for a number of reasons. Primarily, most of us are interested in deforestation because of carbon emissions, and there are a lot of studies corroborating that importance. But also, there's the issue of how deforestation affects the livelihoods of populations that live in forest areas and whose livelihoods depend on economic activities that are linked to forest areas. And there's, so for example, there's one study by the Fishing and Agriculture Ministry of Brazil that estimates over 700,000 people living in the Amazon that are engaged in economic activities that are negatively impacted by deforestation. So that includes fisheries, which is what we'll look at in this study, but also several other related activities like rubber production and small-scale agriculture and stuff like that. There is an issue here because usually these communities are quite poor. They're less politically organized than lobbies that push for deforestation, mass agriculture, and cattle farming, and stuff like that. So there's really a power imbalance in many of these cases, and that sort of negatively affects outcomes in many parts of the country. And this is true for Brazil, but this is also true for other countries with Amazon rainforest covered. So what can we do about this? Technically, the sort of the quick, easy idea is, well, there needs to be enforcement of anti-deforestation policies. So Brazil, like many other countries, today has very strict policies against deforestation. You can't really go around chopping down trees in the Amazon. You need a license. Very hard to get that license. But the problem is not enacting new laws, it's about enforcement. The Amazon is a huge area. The state doesn't really have the resources to be everywhere all the time. And so that's mostly why deforestation happens. So most of deforestation happening in the Amazon today is illegal. And we can see it through satellites, but we can't really go there and always find people actually deter this illegal activity. So top-down policies kind of it's hard for them to have an effect as big as we want. So one possible solution then is to engage with local populations, people that actually have an interest in preserving the forest, and sort of trying to empower them somehow to collaborate with the state in protecting the forest. Right, but this also faces a challenge because, again, as I said before, there's usually a barrier in terms of community organization, resources. These are usually poorer populations. They do not have many material resources, but they also face challenges in organizing this in terms of social capital and so on. So looking into that, we are going to look into a policy that is not only designed to address this problem, but also, in our estimation, it does that as sort of a secondary effect that authorities have already sort of qualitatively assessed this, but this is there's no sort of quantitative study into the causal impact of this. So we're looking into fishing agreements in the Amazon. So fishing agreements, they are agreements between local initiatives. They are agreements between fishing communities in the Amazon to usually to settle things like when can you fish, how much can you fish, where can you fish, what kind of equipment can you use to fish in certain areas. So it's a governing the commons kind of situation here. And these have existed since the 70s in all over the Brazilian Amazon. They have been developed usually as, they started as an initiative in the 70s by Catholic organizations trying to help fishing communities address the tragedy of the commons problem, which is obviously well known. But more recently, because of new laws, new federal laws that give states the power to regulate, broad powers to regulate fishing, some states have decided to give sort of legal status to these agreements. So usually what happened was that communities would come together, they would sign a document, and the enforcement would be the sort of local informal institutions. Right now, what can happen is that the state will come, and if they are convinced that you're organized and that everyone agrees with those rules, that they don't conflict with the law, what the state will do is the governor will issue a decree officially recognizing these agreements. And so if someone breaks the agreement, you can actually go to the police, go to the judicial system and sort of enforce it. So this gives official status to these agreements. And again, this started in 2011, but there's an ongoing process of communities. They have to apply for this recognition with the state government, and the state government will send agents locally, and they will see if you fulfill the requirements. And if you do, there is a governor's decree recognizing it. But this happens, so every year or so there will be one or two agreements that will be officially recognized. So you have to sort of monitor the official gazette and see agreements being recognized. So there's a sort of staggered effect that will take advantage of. So before I talk a little bit about the theory of why these agreements might matter for deforestation, let me give you a little bit of context about what's happening in the Amazon and why, how these things work, right? So this is a cross section. It's adapted from a work by a colleague in Pará. So it's a section of how these várzea, they're called várzea regions work, right? So if I can, so this is the river. So fishing in the river, so the main river, it can be the Amazon River, it can be other of the many hundreds of tributaries of the Amazon River. This is regulated by federal law, right? So we're not talking about this at all. But we are talking about the much more interesting fishing in the seasonal lakes that exist in the Amazon. So these lakes are temporary. They so you see this house. So people live in houses like this. This will fill up, and the river will reach sort of this sort of level, but it will dry up and will form these lakes. And these lakes are important because one, they are the best places to fish. Right. So if you ask fishermen in the Amazon, they'll say, well, this is where the money is for several reasons that don't really matter to us. But also that they care a lot. These lakes are very dependent on rain levels, so they might not form at all. But they are very dependent on the preservation of the forests that exist here and here because of erosion. So erosion might sort of destroy these lakes or affect them negatively. But also you need to protect these lakes because usually for most of the fish species in the Amazon, this is where they reproduce, right? So the fish will be stuck here, and this is where they will reproduce, and this will fill up, and the fish will move freely later on. Right. So there's no law sort of regulating fishing in these lakes, and this is where these agreements come. Right. So these are a few pictures of like real life agreements being sort of recognized in the Amazon. So there will be these huge assemblies. So everyone has to take part. People have to come in, and they'll send people like this gentleman here, who's a government representative. They will come in and they will say, well, have you fulfilled all the requirements? They'll collect documentation and signatures, and everyone has to be together and sort of promise that they like this agreement. They're okay with it. They want the government to actually recognize. So there's a real sort of social capital dimension that you can see, and these are all taken, by the way, from the internet, and there are loads of online pages on social networks by these communities. You can find fishing agreements in the region of X, and you can find people engaging and talking about how fishing works there and so on. So they're obviously designed to balance the needs of fishing community and their economic needs with long-term conservation. And they can regulate a bunch of issues like how much each family can fish. They're usually based around families and communities, right? So you'll see along a tract of river, there will be a number of sort of isolated communities, and they know each other, they talk to each other, but they live kind of separately. So these are by definition communities, but each community might have one or more families in them. So they regulate things like if you see the decrees, they have information like how many families can fish, if they allow commercial fishing, close season dates, and so on. So, and I already kind of talked about these ideas that you can enforce. You can go to the police, and people actually do that if someone breaks these rules. Yes.
That's a clarifying question on that. They're state dependent. You were saying sometimes the lakes don't form if it doesn't come high enough or whatever, or it's setting out how. Your second bullet point there on the next slide.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So they are. So they can be recognized. They can only be recognized if the state comes in.
So I can state the world dependent.
Oh, yeah.
So there's an agreement as to what happens if the rainfall's at level or?
No, usually no. The agreements are much simpler than that. So they're usually about who can fish and what equipment you can use and how much you can fish. But they're not complex at level of, so what happens if the lakes don't form this year or something like that? They don't cover that. Anyway, so did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
But the key point is just if the lake's much smaller than usual, it's the same set of people that can still use it because this is regulated by some agreement.
Yeah, that can happen. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that can happen. So the agreements are obviously focused on fishing, which is obviously important, and there has been work on whether they affect they can affect fishing, fish stocks, and other people have engaged with that. But we're interested in whether there is a spillover effect to deforestation, right? And we have some qualitative evidence. So we've been doing interviews with people that are involved in this world, and there is evidence that suggests that even state agencies that have recognized that there is an effect, there is a positive or a negative impact on deforestation, which is something that they actually want to exploit. And they have been encouraging these communities not only because what will happen in practice is that these people will go out and they will monitor if there is, say, fishing from outsiders, and they will monitor if there is fishing from using equipment that is not allowed for that region, and so. But they are being encouraged by state officials to also look for deforestation, illegal mining, other activities, and to report them using usually radios and stuff like that. Yes, sir.
Is everybody in these communities fishing dependent? Because you could imagine that some people are not fishing, want gold miners, timber or the plantation crops to come in because that would give them benefits.
Yes. Yeah, most of these communities, I would say, the overwhelming majority of people in these communities are fishermen or
the assumption is that the benefits of the gold miner, timber company coming in would not accrue to these local communities.
Well, in some instances, I'll talk about that in a bit, but this is one of our the things we are actually looking at. So back to this, primary goal is curbing illegal fishing, but they can also spot other activities. So these are the currently recognized fishing agreements. This is the state of Amazonas, which is where we're looking at. This is much more developed in this state. This is the whole state of Amazonas. These are municipal boundaries. And these are the fishing agreements. We downloaded all the legislation and we manually coded these shapefile with the boundaries of fishing agreements. Right. So these are our questions. Does the official recognition of a fishing agreement reduce deforestation? And if so, what are the mechanisms behind it? And we have a number of possibilities. So this speaks to our theoretical concerns. First, there's an obvious link with the previous literature that discusses the importance of social capital to govern the commons. So one possibility is that these fishing agreements empower local groups that have vested interest in resource preservation. Also, going back to the question before about how fishing agreements can provide economic incentives that take people away from activities like mining or logging. So this is what you see in real life. Say someone comes in and they say, well, I want to mine, there's gold, there's something here, and I want to mine here, and I have capital, and I want to hire these people. And so people will be drawn away from, say, fishing, and they will be engaged in mining or logging or cattle ranching or some other activity. This is one mechanism that could be happening here is that people are becoming, fishing is enough to sustain them, and they will be less likely to engage in these other activities. Third, fishing agreements can increase enforcement. So this can maybe bring these communities to the attention of the government. And so there will be more enforcement in these regions for some reason or another. And fourth, fishing agreements might be correlated with other environmental activities, say enacting more environmental legislation. And so it's not the fishing agreement itself that is doing the job here. It's more other stuff that is happening alongside the fishing agreements. And maybe the fishing agreement is even making people think more about the environment, and you'll have more legislation, right? So we do two things here. First, we do a differences model. Using this sort of staggered differences model to look into the effect of official recognition at the municipal level. So the treatment group is municipalities in the Amazonas state that become part of the treatment group when at least there's at least one fishing agreement formally recognized. And then the control group, they're not yet treated municipalities in all the states that have this sort of legislation to recognize fishing agreements. And second, so this is still the differences. We implement these estimated by Martin and Turfoy, which allows the design with heterogeneous timing and non-binary treatments. And we use a bunch of covariates here: population, count of fines for environmental infraction, exports, cattle head count, homicides, water area. It's also obviously very important here. It's important to notice that one of our concerns early on was maybe some municipalities don't have water in them or rivers in them, so you can't really use them as part of the control group, but all municipalities in the state of Amazonas have water area in them, and so you can't really delete any of them. Rural conflicts and conservation units, federal, state, and municipal. Right? Also, we do the spatial regression discontinuity design. It's similar to the previous paper in terms of what we're doing here. We're estimating the local treatment effect of the fishing agreements on deforestation at the pixel level, right? So pixels that so we're using the satellite data, and we're looking at pixels that are close to the boundary within the fishing agreement versus outside, right? And we kind of we calculate a bunch of these robustness checks that will show. Right. So here are some of our preliminary results, and I'll pass on to Gabriel to talk about.
Thank you. So this is the graph that shows our main effects from our differences estimation. And you might see here our main identification assumption is parallel trends. So before the agreements are recognized, we don't see a significant effect of the agreements on deforestation levels, but also there is a trend across the years prior to the recognition of the agreements. But after that, we see a negative and significant effect of the recognition of the agreements on deforestation levels. And this is the average cumulative effect per treatment unit, which shows a reduction in -6 square kilometers in per treatment unit, which is kind of high, so like 600 soccer fields. And this is the formal test for the joint nullity of the placebo periods.
So if you go back to the previous slide before
Sure.
this, one period, how big is that effect? 20%?
So that's the deforestation variable is in level. So here it gets to up to 23 square kilometers in the last period. And that's the average effect per treatment unit. And this is the result for our regression discontinuity estimates. Here, the dependent variable is not in level because in the previous estimation, we obviously have municipalities with zero deforestation and municipalities with higher levels of deforestation. So it would not be the best idea to log this variable. But here, since we are dealing with polygons that where deforestation happened, we have the log of deforestation as our dependent variable. We see similar results to the difference in differences design, but the magnitude is much higher, obviously, because this is a local effect. So areas that are immediately out of the agreements and areas that are immediately within the agreements. And that's the average effect, local effect of the recognition of the agreements on deforestation. So 99% reduction in deforestation outside the border of the agreements. And yeah, as Eduardo mentioned, we use the computationally based approach to find the optimal bandwidth where we calculate these effects. But we also collected, and that's back to differences and differences, other variables than the timing of the treatment. And these were the number of families involved in the agreements, the area of the agreements, and communities involved in them. And what we see is that the effect for social capital-based treatment definitions are much stronger than, for instance, the area. And so what this tells us is that for each new 100 families included in agreements, we see a plus -3 square kilometers in deforestation. And here for each 10 communities, and here for each 100 hectares included in the agreement. But also, since we observed this effect, we wanted to know more deeply whether what's driving the effect is social capital. So we collected this data set and compiled it that encompasses the number of civil society organizations in each of the municipalities in the state of Amazonas. And what we observed is that there was an increase in the number of civil society organizations after the agreements were recognized. And similarly to the difference in differences results, we see a more pronounced effect at the end of the period we observed municipalities. But another step we took was to see whether not only the agreements cause an increase in the civil society organizations, but also whether in places where there are more civil society organizations, the recognized agreements have a larger effect. And what we observe is that in these municipalities where civil society organizations are the most prevalent, the effect is the largest. But we also had other explanations to why these fishing agreements might have caused deforestation, which were the inaction of local environmental legislation, but we do not see an effect on that. New agro and fisheries firms in those municipalities, which is also not the case, and it could have been also enforcement, right? But we also don't observe an effect distinguishable from zero and the enforcement levels in municipalities where fishing agreements were recognized. And what we get from the combination of our results is that, and what we think is that the empowering local communities and increasing social capital is what is driving the reduction in deforestation after agreements are recognized, but especially the interaction between the state and these communities when the agreements are recognized.
So one quick thing before we end. So we have compiled data on the economy sectors where people are working, including mining and so on. And we're in the process of sort of analyzing whether this other way of, so here we look at the number of firms, but we can also look at the number of jobs and allocation of the labor force. This obviously takes more time. We haven't yet done this, but this is one of our next steps. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any sense of how many of these municipalities have the local agreements but haven't been recognized by the state? And like, what is driving the states to recognize certain agreements and not other ones?
Yeah, so our estimation is that there are very few agreements that So one thing we know is that there are no agreements currently that have applied for recognition that haven't received recognition. So we know that from a sort of a freedom of information request. So there's no sort of waiting list of any kind. But we can't really know how many informal agreements exist. We know, again, this is very anecdotal, that there are communities trying to organize and put together all the documentation to apply for this, but it's impossible to know how many.
And the benefit that they get from getting recognition is that they can rely on the state police.
Yeah, so they can rely on police, on the justice system to enforce these agreements. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
And you mentioned at the start that everyone knows the major problem with the legislation on forest conservation was enforcement. I get the sense from this that this has been one mechanism to both increase perhaps imbalance in political power and maybe more information on where things are happening. So I guess my question would be, but then the place one would want to go on research is, okay, what are alternative mechanisms for information flow?
Yes.
What are alternative mechanisms for political power? And of course, to compare with this one in particular. And my related question is on the enforcement. So you do say that the state police do enforce this, and they do enforce more directly what the real problem is. I don't have anything to say about that other than, well, that's interesting. Why,
So why wouldn't they enforce the informal agreements?
No, why wouldn't they enforce the first issue, which is just not cutting down the trees, that directly go to it versus this sort of circuitous route. But anyway, just observation.
Yeah.
I think I'm comfortable enforcing.
Well, the thing,
fishing, but not comfortable just to go right after.
So here's my take. So I don't think this is about the police are going there to patrol and enforce fishing agreements. So communities are doing that themselves. So communities are being encouraged to organize and see if there is something illegal going on, and they can then report to police. So the idea here is that police wouldn't have, so state authorities wouldn't have the capacity to patrol themselves, but they do have the capacity to say, prosecute someone or, find someone if there is, if local population are patrolling and denouncing these activities. They potentially could intervene, and that at least increases the cost of these activities marginally.
Sorry, you might have to move the questions on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries.
Sure. Thanks, Turner.
Great, I'm excited to talk to everyone today about climate politics in Indonesia. Indonesia is a place where climate change and the impacts of climate change have direct and pressing consequences, a place where massive swaths of the forest have caught on fire, releasing gigatons of climate emissions, a place where rising sea levels have directly impacted people's daily lives at the coast. And so this is a place where the country faces and the government faces a type of environmental crisis, but nonetheless, we have policy in action. We have not seen aggressive climate policy coming out of the Indonesian legislature. Instead, what we see is continued resource-driven development with widespread deforestation, large-scale strip mining, and even national fossil fuel subsidies, not taxes. With little mention of environmental policy, this is showing for you a tabulation of the percentage of candidates that mention specific issues. Green is the environment, and you see that the green bars are much lower than the other bars across levels of government, national down to regions. And so what this paper is about, the question that we ask here, this is with my co-author Nick Kuipers at Princeton in the politics department. The question that we ask is what explains policy inaction on environmental issues in this important context. This will first be a paper about measurement of policy preferences. We will have new original national level survey data to go after this measurement question. This is then a paper about how politicians' preferences get updated as we conduct an informational experiment. This, relative to the much broader literature on climate preferences, is going to be the really novel thing. We've gone and we've worked with 800 plus local legislatures to conduct an informational experiment. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the frictions facing the translation of voter preferences. We're going to find that voters do care about environmental policy to a certain extent. The frictions preventing the translation of these pro-environment preferences among voters into policy action by politicians. So I will then start with the measurement. The measurement, again, is new national level, nationally representative survey data of both voters and of candidates for national legislature in Indonesia, conducted over multiple waves, primarily in the lead up to the general election in Indonesia not so long ago, just earlier this year. In terms of the voter survey, this is going to be part of a broader project thinking about kind of voter attitudes on politics. This is going to be conducted online by this survey provider, part of a broader project of trying to measure in real time how policy preferences and policy kind of actions respond to real-time shifting in policy, in policy sort of landscapes. Okay. And so then what we're going to have is quota sampling to ensure representation nationally, but also down to the regional level across age groups and importantly as well. Now, this is an online survey. It's natural to think that the results of an online survey will not necessarily be representative once we want to think about kind of aggregate preferences. We're going to have a validation check here in this online survey. We've gone and we've asked voters' preferences over specific politicians in the lead up to the national election. Both before the election and after the election, we have in effect polled voters on who they will vote for and who they think they will. And we can compare that to the actual realized results from the election in the exit polls. And we can see that on political lines, at least, even though we have an online survey, even though our survey sample is more educated than the national average, for example, along political lines, there hasn't been a kind of bias that emerges in terms of polling. So we've gone and we validated these survey results. And so first, what we're going to do is we're going to measure preferences. The first and primary set of questions we're going to ask is to ask voters to identify what they think about the importance of 7 issues where we've gone and we've kind of hidden these environmental topics, pollution and climate change, within a broader battery of questions about issues more broadly. And what we find is that voters, a lot of voters, more than 50% of voters on average, say that climate issues, both climate change and pollution, are very important. So some idea that voters do actually think that climate change is an issue. Now, that's climate change and pollution. Climate change maybe being kind of an abstract notion. And so what we do is we also go back to voters and ask them about very concrete manifestations of climate change. Whether having many very hot days that make it difficult to work is an issue. Whether as a farmer having a short and variable rainy season that potentially hurts the harvest or crop growth is an issue, rather than climate change as an abstract notion. And we find even higher percentages, 80% here up to just under 95% here about property damage from forest fire or smoke. For concrete issues, we find even stronger pro-environmental preferences among voters, including when we press voters and say, what if acting on the environment with environmental policy comes at the cost to economic development? Most voters are okay with that trade-off, please.
The question was, will it a backward looking or forward looking?
Neither, just in general, do you think that this issue is important? That's the voter side. Go ahead.
Do you have a sense of what this looks like if you ask farmers in the US?
Uh,
What do you think about climate change, just to like get a benchmark, whether it's particularly salient or?
I don't know, but I think people have collected those data, so that would be great for us to benchmark against. Thank you. Please.
Is the graph that you're showing us now after you've asked the several components, in some way you're priming them to think about all the issues that the environment is causing, and then of course the government should do more, but it doesn't mean I would want them to shift.
Of course.
Yeah.
It turns out that these two questions were in a follow-up survey to voters. Rohini asked me if climate change is too abstract a notion, and so that I delivered. I went back, we talked to voters for specific concrete issues, and so that also helps to solve this concern as well. This was a different survey. Wonderful. Okay, so that's on the voter side. Now we want to talk about candidates. These are local legislative candidates. Think higher than city council, but sort of state legislature in the US, or in the US would be the analog here. And this is randomly sampled. We're looking just at candidates in the top 3 polling positions and from the top 10 parties with pretty high contact rates, and then follow up at 92%. And so this is sort of the main initial finding that we're going to try to unpack over the course of the paper and in the presentation today. This idea that politicians underestimate the concerns that voters have about the environment. And so what I'm plotting for you here is first order beliefs for voters. This is voters themselves. Do they think that climate change, for example, is very important? Okay, as I mentioned before, around 50% think climate change and pollution are very important. And then in the gray, what we're plotting is second order beliefs by the politicians. That is to say, we asked politicians, what percentage of voters do you think that climate change is very important? Okay, so this is voter preferences, and this is politicians' perceptions, what they think, what they estimate voter preferences to be. What's sort of interesting here is there's good alignment on sort of traditional issues like healthcare or education or the economy, but where you see the divergence, and rather large divergence, is on these environmental issues. And so what are we going to do with that? We're going to now return to politicians with an informational experiment. Please.
I was wondering on the previous slide whether you think the magnitudes matter compared to the ordinal relations across these topics and what politicians end up doing.
Absolutely. We went back to voters exactly to ask this question. So here everything is what we call in the paper absolute preferences. So I asked every issue in isolation. Climate change by itself, do you think it's important? It's natural to think that if we go back and ask people to actually rank the different issues, that we'll get different answers. We turned out not to get different answers, but I'll show that to you in just a bit. Is that the question?
No, I was asking, so if you just look at the ordering of the preferences by voters and politicians, the magnitudes may be diverging for some.
Oh, I see, but the rank is the same.
Yeah.
No, exactly. Okay. So the story of the talk today is that we'll try to figure out why it is that when we go to politicians and give them this information, they respond in some ways and not others. And then I'm going to go to frictions. Again, one of the frictions will be precisely this. Maybe it's not about absolute preferences, maybe it's just relative preferences. And maybe that's why politicians don't respond with strong policy support. So that's exactly one of the frictions that we're going to point out. That will be an important part of this story.
You have data on voters' beliefs about other voters' beliefs?
I don't think we asked that. Yeah, but we could. Leo Burstein has conducted kind of surveys with that kind of flavor. Do you think that others also think? And if you're alone, then maybe it's sort of different. We didn't, but we could. Please, John.
Just wondering how politicians learn about voter preferences, and if a key conduit is their surgery, local surgery with their constituents, whether somehow health and education are more likely to generate concrete demands in one new clinic in the hospital and in school, in a way that pollution and climate change don't.
Absolutely. We see that as part of, that's a very natural explanation for for this, absolutely. We're not ruling that out. What I'll show you in the information is very simply, we have this divergence here. We can now talk about whether this divergence is a real divergence or not a real divergence, but we're going to give this information to politicians and see how they respond. That's a well-defined question. That's a well-defined experiment. And then after I show you those results, then we'll try to unpack why we see what we see in the experiment. Wonderful. Okay, so this is the experiment. We're going to randomly communicate this graph here, okay, to politicians on all issues, not just the environmental issues. And then we're going to measure then how politicians respond to that information in terms of how they rate the urgency of policy action for specific kind of issues like extreme heat or flooding, and also support, again, for specific policies like a deforestation. And so first, again, we can debate whether that graph is picking up something meaningful or not meaningful, but what we can tell you in a well-defined way is that politicians do respond to that information. How? When we go back and poll politicians on how they think voters think, those second-order beliefs, it is on these issues, these environmental issues, where there was a big divergence between the gray and the black dots. We also see it, by the way, on the minority rights issue, where there was also this divergence. We do see that politicians update. I'm showing you here what they think voters think, but we also see this same updating on what politicians themselves think about the importance of these issues. So we take this as some evidence that politicians learn there's some action happening following this experiment. But no greater sense of urgency for action on deforestation, on flooding, on extreme heat, and also no greater support for actual concrete policies to solve these climate issues, whether it be deforestation bans or carbon tax. And so now we're going to ask, precisely to think about Jing's question in part, why it is that these voter preferences are not translating in our kind of little experiment into support concretely by politicians for policy action on the ground. And so we're going to entertain three pieces. The first is that maybe there's some fixed cost of policy action. And so I'm not going to update my policy platform every single day just because I got some new information. We're also going to think about elite capture, which is particularly important in this context where deforestation is driven by large-scale agribusiness, palm oil, logging, mining, that plays a role in politics in Indonesia and puts constraints on the implementation of environmental policy. And then lastly, exactly to Jing's point, it may just be that voters care in an absolute sense, but not in a relative sense, and that is exactly what we're going to find. It's just the case that voters prioritize other issues. So the upshot of this is going to be that there are some frictions that are going to be in place. Please.
Is there a sense in which the politicians feel like they do have agency over policy that could affect these things? Like, I mean, it may just be, I see this about my voters, I see that there's an issue here, but there's no levers I can pull to make a meaningful difference.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important point. We are going to find that.
I mean,
Yes.
to me, exactly my question. I wondered if some of the examples you gave, there might be some variation in that. So something like, you know, the climate change writ large one is harder to think about. But for instance, for the particulate pollution from fires, can you distinguish those regions where the fires are local versus your downwind? Something where there might be variation in how far they could actually affect any change over these outcomes and therefore care.
Perfect. Thank you. We can look into that.
I guess what probably there was, it's sort of surprising that even on the stated preference question about like, do you care about these things, that doesn't move, because like that's costless to change, right?
That one doesn't move. This is. Oh, I see, for policy action.
For policy
Sure,
action, it could be like, I'd love to.
Now, one thing that helps for this particular concern, and it's an important concern, is that we're going to think about heterogeneity along these top two margins, and there are going to be buckets of politicians where their stated policy preferences actually do move. Now I'm into that second concern, which is, well, it's just free for them to say so. But at least that helps with the first two. Perfect. Okay. The first one is these fixed costs of policy action. Because there's switching costs to changing your policy platform as a politician. That's going to generate stickiness in your action or your inaction in particular, even as new information comes in the context of this little stylized experiment. And so what we're going to find is that the support for policy action, so this was that point one in responding to Mike, there's going to be a bucket of politicians where they had very high initial misperceptions. They find out that they're super far off base. Okay, now I'm going to pay the fixed cost to adjust my policy platform. If I was wrong before, but I wasn't that wrong, then maybe it's just not worth it for me to update. Okay, and so for that group of politicians, they're not going to do anything, but we do see this action among those who actually do, who are willing to pay that fixed cost. Two, we can think about elite capture. This is a context, as I mentioned before, where local elites very much benefit from exploiting the environment, exploiting the forest. And these local elites have power, monetary power, and sort of probably physical power too, and political power to capture politicians through the electoral campaign system. And so what we're going to have is a measure of elite capture by district. This is what I think, in a way, Claire sort of has in mind, another margin of heterogeneity. This is the one that we went with so far. A measure of elite capture whereby public officials are required to report their assets. And so what we do is we look at the assets of the top 20 officials in every district. And the idea with this proxy is that if a district has officials that are very, very wealthy, because the civil servant salary in Indonesia is not that high, then maybe that money came from somewhere suggestive of being elite capture. That's sort of what we want. I want to focus your attention on this deforestation ban question, because this is the place where we would kind of expect the heterogeneity, because it's really the deforestation policies that hit the palm oil resistance, okay? And so it's only in those districts with low assets where we see any action. Nobody likes a carbon tax. Nobody likes a carbon tax. Why? Because a carbon tax would overturn the fossil fuel, the national fossil fuel subsidy. That's going to be a bit orthogonal to this asset. So my claim is that this action that we see in this bucket helps, at least with Mike's initial. Okay, and then lastly, to come to the issues that Jing has importantly raised, it may just be that voters prioritize other issues. It may just be that in that first graph that I showed you with the gray and black dots, it may just be that those are absolute preferences in isolation, where importance is asked issue by issue. But instead, if we ask voters to rank the issues, then it's just going to reveal that they care about other things, given that policy action has opportunity costs. And so we're going to return to voters to ask the question in a few other ways that I think help a little bit to get at this important problem. One, we're going to ask them just to rate their single most important issue among the lot. Which one do they think is most important? Two, instead of asking them to rate the importance of each one disjointly, we're going to give them all of the issues at once and ask them to rank order these issues. And then we're also going to have this, in politics, they call it a conjoint experiment. We're going to have voters choose among sets of two politicians, many sets of two politicians, where we've randomized the platforms of those candidates that the voters are hypothetically choosing between. And all of this will help us to disentangle some of the elements we've been circling around.
I'm just wondering, do you have a sense of whether voters or politicians think of these issues as distinct? Like, when they think of health, are they not thinking about the wildfire impacts on health, or the economy, they're not thinking about deforestation impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this relates to the what in my mind I call the Rohini question, which is, climate change entails farmers thinking about agriculture, or me thinking about kind of air pollution effects. Okay, air pollution we kind of put separately, and so that helps there a little bit. But you're right. I mean, my short answer here is that yes, it can be the case that climate change is just kind of a broader bucket of issues. This will not be so much a paper that can pin down exactly the margin, the sub-piece of climate change that voters care about. We're sort of thinking as a package too, except for pollution. That one we do have separate.
Could it be that voters have biased
perceptions of the costs of different policies. So we could maybe compare rankings, saying like, what would you prefer, like £100 invested in education or £100 in climate change adaptation to make a comparison?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we can go back and ask voters. When we came into this, our initial thought was that maybe voters, it's not that they don't care about climate change, it's just that they don't have perfect information about the benefits and the costs.
It's maybe too abstract, like education that's been in school, but climate change is, well, you name it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that those concrete issue questions help. Those concrete issue questions help, right? Sort of flooding or extreme heat, but maybe even those are sort of too abstract. But I think if you're a farmer, you care really about the rainy season and whether it's variable and whether it's coming, and that I think is about as close to on the ground as you can get. And farmers are sophisticated. We know this. Farmers know the timing of the rain and what happens if the rain does not come. Okay, and so please, Veronica, go ahead.
Have you thought, or have you asked politicians also more like questions related to climate adaptation? So maybe for voters, what's relevant in our case, maybe they don't think that politicians can really, with climate action, can stop climate change. Maybe they can do things to, help them cope.
Yeah, absolutely. We can go back to, well, okay, so we're not going back to politicians anymore because the election is over. We do think about the sort of, there's one way we can go, which is we can read really into the distinction between pollution and climate change, where pollution is kind of almost on the adaptation side, maybe not entirely because it's related to emissions. For now, we don't.
But it's for domestic externality.
Exactly. So it could just be that politicians only care about the domestic and not the international, and that helps with. Okay, I'm down to the last 5 minutes, so let me get through this this piece, which is showing you what these different ways of asking the question to voters yields in terms of results. These are those absolute preferences. In isolation, each one, is it important or not? This is the single most important issue. So down here, climate change and pollution are lower. They're also lower in terms of voters rating them as the single most important issue. They're also just lower once we ask for the ranking of the issues. And indeed, to Jing's point, when you ask the relative bit, ranking the issues, it is similar to what voters kind of think. Magnitudes maybe are different, but the ranking is similar. And then what I also thought was interesting was this candidate conjoint, where a candidate putting climate change issues or pollution issues at the forefront of their platform was bad enough to voters that it was equivalent to a candidate being non-high school educated relative to high school educated. Okay, so large in terms of magnitudes here. And so it may just be that politicians have opportunity costs of policy in mind. And so although on its face, maybe this seems like there's some hope for voter preferences to translate into policy action, indeed, in practice, it's much more complicated than that. Okay, so what we want to highlight in terms of how we're framing this is there's the information issue. We go to politicians with the experiment. They don't respond in the way we think. Here are three, I think, all important reasons why those preferences may not translate into policy. So we're highlighting this multiplicity of issues facing climate action in the world today. Where I want to highlight that what matters here is the political economy. And so now a short aside into heat in Indonesia, same context, still deforestation, focusing on spatial heterogeneity from large deposits of decomposing organic material in specific places in Indonesia that are extremely carbon dense. And what we see is if we look at, this is from my palm oil paper, the emissions coming out of palm oil deforestation, the emissions from the slashing and burning of those peat forests is about 80% of total emissions. And so with Robin and Veronica and Ben Olken, we're going to take seriously this spatial heterogeneity. Noting that in this context, what policymakers have used is bans on peat as opposed to our classic Econ 101 Pigouvian carbon tax. And indeed, when we think about domestic welfare losses, how much welfare loss arises for any particular given level of desired emission reductions, we see that a peat ban is worse, it's less efficient, there are bigger welfare losses relative to the classic Pigouvian tax. Okay, the peat ban at 3 meters of peat depth is down here in terms of how effective it is. Okay, so maybe you want to be more up here, fine. But the dotted red line is above the blue line. And what we want to note here is we want to take seriously distributional impacts across producer surplus and other margins that make up this welfare. What we want to note is that actually the peat ban is going to be missing something. It's going to be missing an opportunity to raise government revenue. When you put in a Pigouvian tax, the government raises revenue. When they just ban peat, they aren't going to raise any revenue. This is why typically the Pigouvian tax is better, it's more efficient. But the peat ban is going to be better for producers. The producer surplus loss for any given level of kind of target emission reductions is lower under the peat ban than the carbon tax. Why? Because as a producer, if you're relatively clean, if you come in under the ban, you don't have to pay any tax at all. If you're a relatively clean producer, you would have come in under the ban, but instead there's a carbon tax in place, you need to pay a tax now. You don't like that as a producer. And so these distributional effects are going to be, we think, important politically, because those producers are going to lobby against those profit losses, even if the Pigouvian carbon tax dominates in terms of welfare. This will all be more complicated and give rise to interesting economic richness once we start thinking about the heterogeneity of emissions, once we think about a regulator that can see where peat is, but doesn't necessarily understand what private profits are. Those are unobserved. And especially if it's the case that it's actually the most profitable, low-cost producers that have the highest emissions, in which case with a ban, you would counterintuitively have to ban those with low emissions, not those with high emissions. So it doesn't kind of translate. That's what this project is about. Just to, I promised Robin I would plug this project. Please about it.
So going back to the previous paper, I've had two comments. One is, could you get a different measure of elite capture? Because sometimes these politicians might be quite savvy at not having very high personal assets, but sort of very wealthy families are connected in different ways. And I think some savvy ones might be particularly good at sort of hiding their connections.
Agreed.
So that's one thing. The other is, to what extent do you think voter preferences could be endogenous in this particular context? Because so many of these politicians are very connected to coal as well as agribusiness, and might have been actually doing some very strategic messaging over a long time period. So I'm just curious whether that could be something that you've already considered or have some.
The second, not as much. The first, I think that what that does is it makes our measure of elite capture kind of an imperfect measure. I'm going to conclude and take one question and then let us all go on break. To return to the main paper, this is a paper that thinks about voter concern and whether politicians underestimate it. We inform politicians with an experiment and find that it does do something. They do update their preferences. But nonetheless, there are these frictions, these important frictions between preferences and policy.
We just think about large misperception on minority rights, and minority rights is relatively important to voters. So I wonder if that can help you state that what if these issues were more important.
Perfect, thank you. Other questions? I'll take the questions and then I'll answer them offline, please.
Yeah, in the relative ranking that you propose, you sort of consider these aspects as independent, because strikes me that things like pollution and health are actually quite related. So, politician investing in pollution is effectively investing in health.
Absolutely.
So maybe that changes the cost effectiveness.
Absolutely. Related to Deb's question before, that these things are not so separate. Please.
Yeah, I was just wondering one could be how fast it is.
Absolutely. I think it's super interesting. We did a one-off where we give one piece of information and look what responses were there, but the kind of dynamics over time I think are interesting as well. We can
Just linking your second and your first presentation. I guess one way of thinking about the relative ranking that politicians are putting, say, education higher, is they're presumably thinking that everything costs dollars. Your example of the peat ban or carbon taxes, they don't cost dollars. So another way of asking them to rank would be to give them specific policies where education costs money, but climate change policies don't cost money. And then to see if you still see this issue that they rank education more.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks everyone. Just remind you, we have a break now. We do coffee on the opposite side of the hallway in that little room. And if we can ask everyone to be back at 3 sharp for Rohini set. Thank you.
It might be a sign.
How's your movement? Sound bites.
Testing 1 2, testing 1 2, testing 1 2.
Trying to avoid, I really go see you.
This is very informative.
Yeah, I think we're gonna get started. If anybody needs to speak, you'll feel up here in the front. So the format for the next 2 hours is we have Rahini Pandey, who's a professor at Yale, former PhD student here. We're gonna talk for an hour as part of the master lecture on carbon credits. And then after that, we're gonna have a policy panel with 5 policy makers. And I think because we have memory loss, very quickly I'll introduce the policy panel after an hour rather than now. And the idea there is to kind of have a discussion about how one creates these markets for carbon offsets. And that's sort of a very concrete question. But Rahini, I would describe as a fellow traveler in the world, like many of us, is discovering environmental economics and how it works. But she has very graciously accepted to give this master lecture. So I'm just going to pass it to her, and then we will come back after an hour to the policy panel. And thank you everyone for coming. Rahini, take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Robin, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's great to be here. And as you say, Robin described me a fellow traveler in discovering environmental economics. I think this is in some ways more a case of trying to link a lot of what we've been doing as researchers with really what's been going on. Going to hold it or keep it down? Yeah. What's been going on, I think, in the policy space. So, the many people in this room I can see who've done a lot of important work in thinking about policies to, say, make payment for ecosystems work or thinking about deforestation. But if you take a step into the policy world and you try to look at what's been happening in terms of ways of trying to bring these policies into agreements that reduce emissions or avoid emissions, there's actually a striking lack, I'd say, of certainly empirical economists in that space. And really, a lot of what I want to do today is, I think, raise some of the issues where I think many of us can talk about, and it'd be great to try and think about, especially in the next session, about how we engage with a lot of the discussions that are going on, specifically in the context of thinking about Paris Agreement targets. So let me start with specifically what the Paris Agreement tried to put forward. So I think there was a general consensus at the time of the Paris Agreement that given IPCC reports and scientific evidence, there was an important need to try to limit the amount of global warming, ideally to 1.5 degrees centigrade, with some recognition that maybe a more realistic goal was something like 2 degrees. Since then, what we've seen is a lot of emphasis on the idea of having a certain year by which the world at large reaches net zero, which means that you emit as many additional emissions as you're taking out from the atmosphere. And we've seen over 140 countries since then put in place net zero targets. Of course, there are many fewer that are linking these targets to either policies or actions. But largely, I'd say the 2 dimensions on which they try to work is one where I think we've seen a lot more discussion, which is often reduced emissions. So think about emission trading schemes that set a cap on emissions as being one classic example. And then there are avoided emissions. So if you can keep forest cover, a lot of the last panel's discussion was on this, you would avoid emissions. If you look at the data, it's certainly the case that both lower income countries and middle income countries are less likely to specifically put in place these net zero targets. And we'll come to that in a bit, but that obviously has to do with their development goals. But also importantly, to date, we see no rules or pledges that take these net zero targets of countries and asks what do they add up to at the global level. Because in the end, what we care about in terms of emissions is global net zero, not necessarily country or individual specific net zero. And I think there is yet no goals on that. And so I think this graph or version of this you've probably seen is if you want it to be consistent with 1.5 degrees centigrade, this is the rate at which emissions have to go down, which is the bottom green line. We're very far away from it. So the top is the sort of with the standard error where we are likely to be given current policies and actions. And then there are increasingly optimistic scenarios depending on what more happens. But we're certainly very far off, at least say the 2030 target at this point. So what has been happening? So if you take just what are the policies and actions in place and ask, can we just scale them up and get to where we need to get to? Well, much of the emphasis right now has been what I call reduced emission policies. So these are domestic carbon pricing policies of the kind of, say, either carbon taxes that Alan was talking about or emissions targeting schemes. So carbon taxes cover roughly 6% of global emissions, and you should think of them as largely hitting industrial emissions. We see around 36 carbon compliance markets. I think since I wrote this, they probably increased a little bit, and they cover around 19%. But we know that both concerns about industrial competitiveness in middle-income and low-income countries mean there's going to be a limit to how they scale up. I think we'll certainly see one more bump coming a lot from China, which is going to, I think, expand its emissions trading scheme a lot. But there is going to be a limit to the scaling up. And importantly, what I think these policies are doing, I think it's extremely important to act on reducing emissions, but they're failing to leverage the gains from trade across countries that you can get if you focus on avoided emissions. So here I put center stage thinking about deforestation. So just to remind you, right now annually, we see around 10 million hectares of land, roughly the size of South Korea, is annually deforested for commercial and subsistence agriculture. There are many reasons to be concerned about deforestation, but they emit roughly 4.5 times as much as aviation or shipping, areas where we've seen a lot of action. Importantly, if you protect these mature existing forests, you're going to get much more carbon storage than reforestation. So sometimes the discussion is in terms of thinking about reforestation or improving degraded forests. That's important, but a much larger bang for buck is going to come from actually maintaining existing forests. Now, it's also the case that when we think about reducing deforestation, you want to start thinking about targeting lower income countries, right? So, the basic fact is it doesn't matter where you reduce greenhouse gas emissions from, but it's often true that doing so is cheaper in low income countries. So even if we need to, by the end, reduce these sort of expensive emissions, you want to start, as long as you have limited climate financing, to get the largest bang for the buck, you want to start with the cheapest to remove emissions. Rachel Glenister and Seema Jayachandran have a very nice Journal of Economic Perspectives piece where they describe how low-income countries will often have lower cost opportunities, especially when it comes to natural capital preservation. They have cheaper land and labor. But at the same time, to achieve this is not going to be like telling low-income countries, this is what you should do. We need to recognize, and the Paris Agreement does so, that you want to do it in the context of equity and efforts to eradicate poverty. Now, when you start thinking about what is involved in development, a lot of the recent literature has focused on energy use. So we see, this is from Michael Greenstone's AEA lecture this year. This is a classic graph that we see all over the place, that there is no rich country that doesn't have energy intensive growth. And so a lot of the discussion has been around how do we move away from kind of fossil fuel based energy to renewables or other forms of green energy. But I think equally important, and perhaps the analogy isn't carried over as much, is that we should think of deforestation really as another form of industrialization. And so this is a graph which I like a lot, which is actually builds on the idea that is in some of Robin's work. So what it does, it basically uses boundaries of different countries. So compares countries that are sort of share a boundary, one is richer, one is poorer, uses that spatial discontinuity to then identify what will be the predicted loss of forest given the income level. And just as a precursor for our panel, it's important to see that Sierra Leone is really up there. So Sierra Leone right now has high forest cover, but also high predicted forest cover. So is Ghana, which I think is another group that's going to be in the panel. And so the countries that are both are likely to become high energy use, but I'd argue that perhaps the energy use is going to go up very fast in India and China, but more slowly maybe in sub-Saharan Africa. But what could happen very fast in sub-Saharan Africa is deforestation. And once that's done, that's going to be hard to reverse. So I think it's important to think about land use as a margin that we want to change, similarly that we think of other industries. So now once we start thinking about kind of gains from trade and try to build on the ideas that Seema and Rachel and others have put in terms of the importance of going across rich and poor countries, one mechanism that has received a lot of attention, and I know will be talked about in the second half of Environment Week, is carbon border adjustment taxes, right? So this is the idea you have, say the EU that has relatively high domestic carbon taxes. You have another country that has low carbon taxes. Well, if they try to export goods into the EU, you're going to tax them at the differential rate. The second is, and that's going to be what I'm going to talk about today, is really multilateral carbon project trading. And here are the kind of three categories that are described, and I'm going to focus on nature-based projects. I'm happy to talk at the end if you have time about analogies. Avoided emissions, which is things that reduce deforestation, reducing emissions, which is what Alan was talking about, say, with peatlands, and then, the very expensive form, which is typically carbon sequestration. Now, there's both good arguments from certainly an equity perspective that you would prefer to make climate finance transfers to low-income countries and get them to protect their forests rather than taxing them. But importantly, Bart Hastad has some work on deposit trade, arguing that there are also efficiency arguments for climate trading, that when you're going to have, when you can actually think of this as an asset that you can trade beforehand, the deposit, you may actually do well by undertaking such trade. So they're both efficiency and equity reasons to focus on carbon trading. But as we'll see, institutionally, it seems to have been very difficult. So before I get into how it's happening right now, just some terminology. So there are two ways in which we can think about carbon credits. So there's first, which is going to be the focus of the voluntary carbon markets, which is carbon offset credits, right? So here you're going to have one token, which is the usual 1 metric ton of carbon emissions. And this is going to be traded on a voluntary market. Okay, so this is going to be, typically the price is going to be set by some, and I'll come to this in a bit more detail, over the counter trade between a buyer and a seller. The second is a carbon permit credit, right? So this is going to be a permit which captures the same 1 metric ton of CO2, but is now traded in a market where there's actually a cap. So this is in a compliance market, and you're allowed to emit it as part of the total amount of permits you need to hold for emissions given the overall cap in the market. So there are two types of carbon markets that correspond to this. There's the regulated compliance markets. So for instance, you can think of EU or the UK ETS system, where you're going to basically rely on carbon permit credits. EU ETS in a previous phase actually allowed for some amount of offsets, which it doesn't anymore, and I'll come back to later. So much of what you should think about, we're going to talk about today with nature-based projects, is going to be traded in the voluntary carbon market, where you're claiming offsets against your commitments. And this is the main mechanism, given that under Article 6.4, which is the main article in the Paris Agreement that would allow you to multilaterally trade projects in order to meet either your own or another country's NDCs, nationally determined contribution, has not been operationalized. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about first, just kind of help you get on the same page on how currently the voluntary carbon market is not functional. It's not functional, it's very small. It roughly covers 0.2% of global emissions. And this is striking, given that this is the main market that land use projects are going to occur through, right? So if we can get it to work, it's going to be important, especially for land use changes. And I'm going to argue that kind of identifying and evaluating the type of reforms we need for this market are very well suited to, I think, what many people in this room think about. It requires us to think about concerns about institutional design and policy implementation in settings where there are a lot of information friction, so a lot of agency concerns, and there's low state capacity. So I feel like that's the bread and butter of many people in the room. And I think, just as I said at the start, that was a lot of certainly my motivation in getting deeper into this market, is that there is a little bit of a disjunction right now, I think, on how institutional reforms are proceeding in this market and what I think many people in this room would recommend as likely reforms. So let me start by just getting us all on the same page in terms of what is involved in a voluntary carbon market. So many of you will have seen advertisements like this. The last one is the one I think most of us see when we buy a flight ticket. So this is actually from one of my transatlantic flights. And it looks very promising, right? So I'm going to take a flight from New York to London. Let's say I put it in the 10 to 12, so I'm even over optimistic about how long the flight is going to be. Is to offset the greenhouse gas emissions caused by my flying transatlantic is strikingly cheap. I just need to pay $32 and I will offset it. And just looking at this number can tell you there's something wrong in the market, right? We don't actually think it's that cheap to offset carbon. And I think that's what we're going to see is what's wrong with this market, right? So let's talk about how the voluntary carbon market works. So the voluntary carbon market is literally what it says, which is it's completely voluntary. There's been no agreement under Paris. It has 4 sets of players in it. So let's go through them one by one. So who are the buyers? So the buyers are emitters. It could be individuals like you and me who's thinking about how to offset a flight. But more importantly, it's very often quite large institutions like Delta, like Google. And some of the more important players right now increasingly are tech companies who, with the rise of data centers, are finding that they're very greedy in energy. They also sort of have shareholders who push them to be environmentally responsible. So you have a set of potential buyers in this market. These are groups who think that it's too expensive to kind of end running their own data center, but they want to offset their emissions. On the extreme other side are the developers. So these are developers, and maybe you can focus in on the forest ones, which is red plus. These are developers who would say, okay, we'll come up with a plan to, say, a payment for ecosystem, which is going to give money to villagers to make sure that they don't degrade their forest. So how do these get matched? How do these developers get matched with those who want to buy it? So that these brokers who come in, these are brokers are usually kind of recognized, but they have limited institutional standing. And so what they're going to do is that these brokers are going to help emitters purchase the carbon allowances. And these are very non-transparent trades usually. So these are over-the-counter trades between 2 people, just the brokers intermediating it. And they're very non-transparent in that you don't know how much is the cost of, say, a metric ton of CO2 versus just the surcharge of different players in that market. And then the main regulation, if any, happens through these registries that largely are meant to kind of track and verify these offset projects and try to ensure that the same project isn't being sold multiple times, for instance. So that's how you'd enter. So they largely try to do it, but they do very little in terms of kind of helping with price discovery in any form. So what happened in this market? So this market over the last, until 2021 was booming. And if you even now go and look at records, there are some estimates that suggest that this is going to really be very large very soon. But then and then before I come to the crash, who was participating in this? So this is data from the world's top 5 companies by market capitalization who had net zero targets. So this was put together by Carbon Brief. And I think this is sort of somewhat illuminating. 75% of offsets currently were purchased in those top 50 companies were fossil fuel companies and car manufacturers. The 3 largest countries that were providing the offsets were Indonesia, China, and Colombia. The single largest provider was Indonesia's Katingan peatland project that sort of said that it was equivalent to taking 2 million cars off the road. And roughly 50% of these were REDD plus forest protection projects. And so, and I'll come back to this again, you'll see this market is failing right now. A lot of people would say it's failed, we should move on. But really, I think at least in the short to medium run, if we want to do something about forests, I think our best attempt is try to fix this market. So what happened? So basically, 2021, we saw this peak. Since then, we've seen a dramatic break. There were two reasons for this. First, kind of post-COVID, there was a stagnation in demand in this market. This market now has pretty low demand. So that started the crash in 2022. But then it was accentuated by a series of negative research findings in 2023. So before I come to the findings, let me talk about what these findings were about. So what these findings were largely about were about kind of non-additionality in projects that were being sold. So just to remind you, what we want to see in a carbon offset credit is that you're paying for a reduction that would not have happened without that payment, right? So that's what you're paying for. You're not paying for someone who's doing a good job already. So in 2023, January, a set of kind of coordinated newspapers, The Guardian, Die Zeit, and German, a couple of others, did on-the-ground reporting, arguing that 90% of rainforest offsets that had top-tier verification did not actually achieve this verification. And then in 2023, and I'll come back to the method, there was a study in Science that took a set of Vera, which is one of the main registries projects, used kind of a synthetic design to get comparable control groups, and actually argued that there was a significant overestimation of their impacts. What's important to recognize is that you could think that, every time we give out subsidies, there is some cost. If we mistarget it, it goes to the wrong person. The problem why this is particularly concerning in the offset market is that people are making decisions based on saying that they've offset their emissions. So if I'm a company, I'm going to continue with business as usual or even expand my emissions because I believe I'm offsetting it. If I believe I'm offsetting, but I'm not offsetting, you're doing real damage because you're actually allowing emissions to increase by more than they would have in the status quo or without an offset policy existing. So in that sense, this is actually much more, I don't know much more, but certainly kind of concerning in a way that goes beyond just a concern with subsidy mistargeting. So let me now talk about why I think these are problems that I think economists are well placed to answer. So the first issue, of course, is there is just adverse selection. Now, if you think about it, and this is in some ways why the offsets are so cheap for your flight, if I set up any system to get people to enter the offset market, who's going to enter at the lowest price? It's people who are anyway not going to deforest because they don't have to change anything about their activities and they get some extra pocket change for doing it. And so, there are papers sort of showing in payment for ecosystem services, the landowners who never deforested are the first to enroll. And I'm going to come back to this. Let me make this point here. I'll make a couple of places. There's been, since those articles, or maybe even before that, there's been a lot of attention to, and I think broad recognition in the VCM market community, certainly on the side of what we would call good buyers, that there is non-additionality in the avoided emissions market for deforestation. I think what there's less recognition of, but I think people in this room will not be surprised, these problems of adverse selection are also going to affect cases of trying to reduce emissions. So any clean development mechanism program where you're trying to get people to say move towards renewables, undertake investments that reduce emissions, can also have selection problems that, a firm that is just very productive might find it cheaper to reduce its emissions by investing in clean technologies, and it might expand its emissions even more. So my colleague, Nick Ryan, has a very nice paper with Daniel Shu and Chen, sort of making this point in the context of China, that you actually see a combination of both adverse selection and also kind of this efficiency gains leading to non-additionality in a project that is about reduced emissions. The second kind of problem we see is, I think, a combination of, I'd say, moral hazard and low state capacity. So the way it works, how do we, you would say, well, people might try to select in, but there should be a whole institutional system that prevents these non-additional projects from selecting in. So how does the market currently work? So there are no ex post evaluations. It's typically all based on baseline evaluation. So you have these baseline verifiers who are going to try to come up with what they call as a comparable counterfactual, on the basis of which they will actually undertake these calculations of how much additionality will be done. Now, these baseline verifiers and the project selectors have multiple objectives. And again, importantly, they're typically paid on the basis of how many credits they successfully verify or sell. So you can see there's an immediate conflict of interest and, therefore concerns of moral hazard. Now, even on top of that, to the extent that these sales are not just happening across countries, but in general, with weak state capacity, it's going to be very hard to monitor ex post often. And so what we find that, there's both moral hazard and low state capacity. And again, I want to emphasize the fact that these problems are not just in the case of deforestation. So it's a very nice recent paper by another ex-LSE student, Jonathan Colmer, and his colleagues, looking at a precursor to VCMs, which is the Clean Development Mechanism, and looking at wind projects. So wind projects are a classic example of kind of reducing emissions by going towards renewable energy, right? So what they find, they take the case of, they code up all the Indian wind farm projects during the period when the CDM was active and do a very simple exercise. They say, if there's another wind project that comes up kind of in a comparable distance, and if anything, is closer to the grid, is more likely to have better wind, and if that gets developed without a subsidy, then this project that got CDM status is likely to be non-additional. And when they do this exercise, they find roughly half the CDM registered wind farms were non-additional. Then they ask, why do we see this? And we say exactly these issues play out. First, the first approvers in any CDM project was the Indian government. The Indian government was also trying to meet its sustainable development goals, which was total amount of wind energy developed. To get more wind energy, you want to have larger wind projects. And so very often you would just maximize that objective rather than the additionality objective. Verification of additionality was largely done by third-party verifiers, and almost all projects were approved. And then finally, which I think this is low global capacity, I shouldn't say country-specific, they point out that in the last year of the Kyoto commitment period, there was a global 10-member CDM board that every day was deciding on 15 applications. Just to meet its criteria. And so you can imagine that it's impossible to do any kind of verification that's more than box ticking. So as a result of all of this, I showed you that there was a crash in the market. The other part on the prices that you see is a lot of difference in the actual price. So remember, the way a carbon offset credit is defined, it's supposed to be the price for 1 metric unit of CO2 emissions, which ideally should, in any compliance market, would have a single price. This is from the S&P index. So the CEC and CNC are indices, the other are just tracks. What you can see is they all fell a lot. But basically, sorry, I hate this, there are two different axes. This axis that's a high level is only for the tech carbon capture. The rest are all on this other axis here. But the main things you should see is this is nature-based avoidance. And this is, this purple is renewable energy. The lower bound you have on social cost of carbon today from, say, EPA is many times more than the prices we are seeing in this market. So there's very little link between the price at which this is being sold, which one way of thinking about it is just the marginal cost you have to pay to a forest owner who was not going to cut down their forest, versus what it actually takes. A flip side of what's happening is the kind of project where you can actually probably assume there is some additionality are going to be these tech carbon capture, which are extracting directly CO2 from the atmosphere. There you end up paying some amount of their fixed cost. They're also more additional, and those are quite highly priced. They're around 120. But otherwise, this market, the price of this market tells you that this is extremely unlikely to be what it should be. So just to summarize, what is happening in the low prices? There's adverse selection and moral hazard, which makes people not being willing to play a lot. There's a high volume of decentralized over-the-counter trades via brokers, very non-transparent pricing. And there are no reliable price signals you get. Also, importantly, right now in this market, there's very low demand. There is nothing, given how much people distrusted, even what we call good buyers, the Amazons and the Metas and so on, are very hesitant to enter this market. Companies are getting accused of greenwashing. Delta actually got a lawsuit from customers saying that you were doing it in a way that didn't make that was greenwashing. So there's a lot of hesitance to enter this market. So is there a future for these kind of voluntary carbon markets? So I think the reason I want to argue why we want to spend some time trying to figure out how we can actually improve these markets is that there is significant interest, I think, from good buyers. These are both tech companies and individuals. And importantly, I think right now, this is one of the few viable sources of climate financing for the Global South. I think we can hope for the loss and damage fund to take off, but there's a reasonable amount of money that actually can be transferred here. So just to give you an example, in 2024, the Symbiosis Coalition was formed by Google, Meta, Microsoft, and Salesforce. I think Stripe and some others have formed another one. And what are they focusing on? They're focusing on principles. So the US Treasury made a statement in May. There's something called Integrated Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which has come up with these carbon principles, none of which we would disagree with. Yes, you should have additionality, you should have robust quantification, you should have no double counting. But these are principles. There's very little discussion of how this is actually going to translate into action. And the main way it's actually translating into action is, to some extent, taking categories where, say, non-additionality has been shown and trying to remove them from the market without recognizing that actually non-additionality is a very broad concern. So in time for Pierce's entry into the room, the current plans for the Paris 6.4 is that you're going to allow emission reductions and removals, not avoided emissions. So what this means is you can do reforestation, but you won't be able to prevent deforestation using Paris 6.4 agreements. So in March 2023, for instance, the UK submission said they were firmly opposed to including avoided emissions. And what they said makes a lot of sense, that it's vital that the 6.4 mechanism delivers real measurable additional reductions and removals. The concept of emission avoidance is, in our view, incompatible with these principles. I think there's nothing wrong with this, but I would argue we'll have exactly the same problem with emissions removal as well. Like, there is nothing about the concerns that are not going to hit any project. It will hit, reforestation as much as it's going to hit deforestation. And I think it's important to recognize that, protecting these existing forests are extremely important. We have work, and I'll come to that in a bit, by Seema and co-authors, showing that if you have well-designed PES systems, you can actually deliver additionality. So it's not as if additionality is impossible in this market. Moreover, I think allowing for this will allow developing countries, many of whom are the world's remaining forests, to actually get climate finance. So Philippines, for instance, has been a major proponent of including avoided emissions in 6.4. And I suspect one of the things we'll see in the discussions in Azerbaijan is a number of lower income countries pushing back against this idea of taking out avoidance. And as I've sort of shown you through some examples already, these concerns of non-additionality and low state capacity concerns impact not just emission avoidance, but also emission reduction impacts. Just to give you an example, I was talking to the head of 1 Acre, which is a large sort of farming. They were talking about how it's impossible for their farmers to enter these kind of reforestation projects because you have to commit to 30 years. And they were like, there is no way we can commit to 30 years. I know Dave is working on this in Sierra Leone and saying similar things, that a lot of saplings will die. And so I think, these issues are going to be true in every case. So what I want to argue, and I think this is where we can hopefully see some action, we need to address, I think, 3 related institutional challenges rather than working on removing or adding some types of projects. I think first you need to restructure the market. We need to ask, what rules are actually going to allow for a sensible carbon pricing. And I think I would argue we can learn from compliance markets here. We need to think about how we're going to measure better, how are we actually going to get additionality measurements that work. And then verification. How are you going to verify these carbon sales and what monitoring mechanisms can work? So I'm just going to give you a few examples. This is certainly not what should be done, but I hope it gives you a flavor of why I think we can make progress on improving these or addressing these institutional challenges rather than simply focusing on kind of saying, oh, we found a problem with this project, so let's remove it and hope that the rest of the market will work. So one other thing that I haven't talked about that I want to come to before I come to solutions is really to think a bit about climate justice, right? So first, offsetting is not going to be sufficient in a world where you need to do two things. You need to eliminate certainly some of the cheaper emissions of global south, but probably a global net zero will always require, maybe slightly later, you're going to have to remove some of the expensive to remove emissions in rich countries as well. And so I think it's important to recognize that offsetting is not the same as achieving a global net zero target. At the same time, I think if you want to have kind of an equitable global net zero, you're going to have to bring both these profitable global north companies and global south emitters to overall net zero. So there's going to be, painful for companies everywhere. And you're going to need to think of that in a way that you can get to net zero. And I think the best thing we know there for doing that is really compliance markets. Without an emission cap that is going to start trying to look at what net zero globally looks like, it's very unlikely. I think it's very unlikely any other mechanism could work. So just to remind you, we now have a set of successful pollution markets. We have SOX and NOx markets in the US. We have EU ETS when its new phase is working reasonably well. And we find that by these caps, you raise prices to a level. So you can see the EU ETS price and just compare it to that of the international carbon credit price. It's many magnitudes different. And what it's going to do is it's going to, we've also seen that it incentivizes buyers and sellers to monitor each other's targets. So I want to give you an example of one market that actually failed with offsets to just make the point that it's not completely simple to do it, which was a market started by Richard Sander, who's an economist, focusing in Chicago, right? So it basically was a voluntary market. You could enter, set your baseline emissions, and then you would try to reach the cap. It allowed carbon offsets to enter this market, and at the beginning, it had quite a lot of success in attracting big players. You had companies like the Ford and DuPont enter, cities entered like Chicago and Oakland, and several universities entered as players. But in the end, this market kind of failed. It shut down in 2010. One was the excess supply of cheap credits from carbon offsets. So, unless you solve these problems of pricing carbon offsets, it caused this to collapse. We saw something similar in the first phase of EU ETS, which is why right now they've removed offsets from it. And then there was also a sense that there was too little demand. Early demand was propped up by the belief of the success of the US kind of cap and trade, the belief that there was going to be legislation. Once that collapsed, no one thought this market would survive. So I think, it tells us we need binding targets, but importantly, we can't get away from high quality credits. So this is to say, it's not that compliance markets itself will be a solution. You're going to need to deal with that problem, but conditional on that, you do see people willing to enter a voluntary market. Next concern you might raise is, if you're going to have this kind of global market, are low-income countries or the emitters in low-income countries going to be capable of sustaining such a market? Right, so there are several reasons why you might be concerned. And right now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about nature-based projects. I'm talking about the fact that to get a global net zero, you're also going to need companies in countries like India and China entering and sticking with some caps on their own emissions. So you may be concerned that this is going to be poor monitoring of that part of the market and insufficient regulator credibility. So let me just briefly, tell you about some work I've done with Michael, Anant, and Nick, and many people in this room, I think, have been part of this project, suggesting that you can actually have compliance markets that work in low-income settings. So we worked in the kind of western state of Gujarat in India. We weren't looking at carbon. We were looking at particulate matter at that time for various political economy reasons. That was the emission the state was willing to regulate. The advantage of it was that this area had enough of these plants that you could have a single cap on the airshed. It took us a long time to build this market, so I think it takes time. But what you see in this market is that this point is where these are the initial mock periods, but period 2, period 1, which is where the market started, there was an immediate opening up in the gap of emissions between the treatment and control, which remained constant. And just to be clear, you don't expect cap and trade market compared to command regulation that applies on a firm to necessarily change compliance. So in rich countries, we always talk about the value of a cap and trade is that it allows you to more flexibly achieve any regulation. We don't expect it to change compliance. In a low-income setting, what we found actually there is an endogenous response even on compliance. The market does a much better job of actually getting to stick to the regulation. So we found compliance worked almost perfectly. Plants bought and held enough permits. There was a single market clearing price. And importantly, the permit holdings varied significantly from the initial allocations. As I mentioned, emissions fell 20 to 30%, and this was an experimental result. And then we used the fact that we had the universe of data on permit bids to show that abatement costs were also lower in this market. So what you expect markets to achieve did that. So this answers the first question, which is that if you were to try to move in the long run to a global compliance market that has emitters from, not just rich countries, but also countries like China and India, that is feasible, right? So the next question is, what if you try to get carbon offsets into this market? Well, you can. So Japan is one example. I'm running short on time. I'll come back to this later. But I think here are some of the open questions. We're going to need to think about the market rules that are needed, especially for nature-based projects. And as a first step in that direction, what we're going to need to do is to fix the problems with better measurement of additionality and being able to do something about just verification in these markets. So let me turn to this, which is the supply side reforms, which if you can get a global market to work, the next question is what conditions are you going to need to have actually nature-based projects enter this market? And I think that's going to need a set of supply side reforms. So you may ask, well, why are these non-additional projects not screened out by current measurement methods? So currently what the concern is that you're setting these counterfactual baselines of how much emissions occur, which are way too high. So you sort of take a forest and you assume the neighboring forest, everything will be cut down. Well, that's not true, right? And this paper that I mentioned, the science, where it uses ex post counterfactual, it found only 7% were additional, and these are all offset projects that have been sold. So there's a lot of emissions that have been generated in the world on the basis of non-additional projects. So, and as I said, these kind of results, the pessimism associated with these results is what leads something like the UK right now to say we should just remove them from the set we'd allow. And I think to me, that's the wrong way to go. And I think we have research to suggest that you can actually do better. So let me talk briefly about, papers that at least, which I think are quite well known. SEMA has a very well known paper with co-authors on looking on whether PES can generate additionality at all. And then together with Kelsey and SEMA and Namrata, we have some work asking, can it work in a low state capacity setting? So just briefly from the paper of SEMA's, this is in Uganda. It was an experimental trial where they took comparable plots, and in some areas, households were paid 70,000 Ugandan shillings for conserving forest. 2 years later, what they find is, a significant reduction in tree cover loss in the areas that they got this payment. Importantly, they found no leakage. And then 2 years later, when this program ended, they found that certainly there was more cutting in the areas that had been under the treatment that had got the payment, but it didn't exceed. So the gains were permanent that you got from 2 years of the program. It wasn't like, they got undone afterwards. So I think that sort of tells you that, you could imagine using evaluations like this to come up with just simple rules, like, for instance, in Uganda, households need to be paid at least 70,000 shillings in a PS program, a scheme that's cheaper than that may work, but is unlikely to. So you can see there's one role there for evaluations. Another concern is, very often in these PES systems, it's conditional payment. So if you don't deforest, you then get paid. But what about settings where farmers are poor? They need to figure out either what they're going to do if they're not going to deforest. So this is slightly more distant an example, but I think it applies, is we wanted to look at crop residue burning by farmers in India. And the question we asked was, if you pay Punjabi farmers some of the money upfront, does that actually reduce crop burning by more? Or is it the fact that now, because you're getting paid some upfront and so you're going to get paid less afterwards, means your incentives to undertake kind of the better action are now even more reduced? So we were really asking whether paying some amount upfront improves trust and liquidity versus reducing this incentives to comply. And what we found is that in this particular setting, the traditional PES had no effect. So again, I think it's an important example to just give a sense that, in some of these settings, just doing these experiments can help you understand where you may not get additionality. But here, what mattered was less giving them more money. Maybe that would have mattered as well, but we didn't do that experiment. But what you could get some bang for the buck was by paying some of that money upfront, which was some combination that people believed the rest of the money would follow, and they were able to possibly care with the liquidity concerns. So let me just say that I think here, there's one agenda that you can see that would help kind of come up with more credible offset programs, is to really take a sandbox evaluation that we can use to establish program standards. And so what would be good is to kind of identify what we think are the classic kind of, say, RED+ projects that you want to have under offset projects, and do evaluations to get some guidelines on it. And then I think another thing that we need to do is, we need to kind of be much more engaged in these conversations about how do we actually develop ex post additionality calculations that can be rolled out at scale. Several of these will not be experimental, they'll be synthetic controls or matched controls, but I think there is more than can be done. And again, this is not a conversation that I think economists or empirical development economists are involved in much. The next thing is, how do we align incentives to verify carbon project? So again, just briefly to talk about how this issue of conflict of interest is real. So this is from the same state that I was working in Gujarat, an earlier study where, the state was using third-party auditors to estimate emissions from high polluting firms. What this shows you, this is data from our control sample, which is very similar to the voluntary carbon market right now. So plants hire and pay the auditors themselves. What you can see here is this is the data that they submitted. So this is the audit report submitted by the auditors. The red line is the regulatory standard, and much of the mass is just around there, right? So basically people are just ticking a box saying that you're under the standard. What we did is we sort of did our own back checks, which was the same week as we knew the auditors were going to be. You can see a lot more distribution. So I think this part is not perhaps surprising. So there are a lot of people who would have been above it, who were paying auditors to get under it. What is striking is there were a lot of good plants. When the market had completely collapsed, basically the auditor was just checking the box around the mean for everyone. And you could see why they were doing it. The price in this market was so low is that it could not cover lab tests for anyone. So given that you couldn't cover lab tests, a regulator may want to use carrots rather than sticks. You may want to use emission markets, which is feasible if there's heterogeneity, but you don't get any of that information when the market has collapsed. So what we did here, what I think was very straightforward, is they had a list of certified auditors, and we said rather than firms choosing, we will randomly assign the auditors to firms, and we will set a fixed payment. And what we found is that, of course, there was still some difference between what the auditors were giving in and what we found, but a lot less corruption. And so I think this is something that I think is quite easy to put in place, is to actually have some independent regulator who's assigning verifiers rather than project developers. And it did not cost much. The project developers can pay into a central fund that's used to pay. So it's really about the assignment rule. And I should say this is something that the state has now adopted at scale. Now, another way of thinking about how you could do this, and we've heard some discussion on Brazil, is to look at kind of how Brazil has moved here. So Brazil now uses a satellite-based surveillance system for deforestation activity. So they have the same, so if you have these two plots, this is the same georeference plot. If you see this change in satellite activity, they condition their monitoring on it. So you would want for any nature-based project some sense that you could get checked in this way. This is monitoring that can be done internationally. One of the big problems is I'm sitting in the US paying dollars for offset project in India. How do I actually know anything will happen there? Well, at least I can put some pressure by kind of having some system that's using this kind of satellite-based imagery. So just in terms of reform agenda, I think you want to have a much more credible verification system. But also, I think you want to start deploying these standardized monitoring techniques. Right now, one of the big problems is most carbon content measurement is proprietary. So if you go out there and try to get a layer to understand how much your forest cover has in carbon, you're going to have to pay for it. There are nonprofits like GeoTrees and C-Trees that are now generating this global data. But they need a lot more money than what they have right now to do this at scale. And again, this would be the kind of thing that hopefully as part of, say, a precursor to a full Paris Agreement, countries and governments should be willing to put money into this. So let me try to end, and maybe we can have a 5-minute break before the panels. I think, what's the big goal? The big goal ideally is to have offset projects that are of high enough quality that they can enter compliance markets. I don't think that's an important goal. This shows you where we are right now. So if you look at this, yellow is if a country has an ETS that allows offsets to enter the market from local projects. So China is the biggest player every time it enters any market. It allows from local projects. Red are markets that don't allow. So as I said, EU ETS in its current phase no longer allows offsets. But two interesting examples are South Korea, that allows offsets from international players, but limits the amount because it's worried about quality. So you can only have 5%. And California that allows it at 3%. So this is, I think, where we want to ideally get to, is some kind of compliance markets. If in the long run, the compliance market itself should be global. But even if it's national, it can start trying to help climate financing by getting there. I think the voluntary carbon market exists. I actually don't think it's going to go away. I think tech players are going to invest in it quite a lot in the next few years. But I think the concern is they're not going to actually address the severe concerns, the kind of institutional concerns with things like non-additionality, but rather they're going to focus on projects that they think you can show additionality more easily. So the extreme case is that low-income countries get pushed out of this market. The only thing that gets funded is carbon sequestration projects in Norway, which are very expensive, right? And I think if you want kind of low-income countries to have their place in this table, we need to start thinking about how we're actually going to move towards, quality rules that are going to let them get in. And so I'm just going to end with a few open questions, which I don't know the answers to, but I think many in this room may be able to think about. First of all, it's going to be expensive to set a high standard for developers, especially in low-income countries. So what are the kind of acceptable ratios we want to have for cost of verification to the cost we're actually giving for the credit? How do we do this in a way that actually maintains project viability in lower income settings? And then how do we design market rules for setting prices when we know there will be uncertainty about project additionality? So recent papers, SEMA has a paper on this from Mexico. I think Ana Russo's paper last year suggested that you can often see additionality on average across an entire market, but not in every single land use plot entering. And so how do we actually price that in? I think there are a set of things that have to do with climate justice if this market is to work for low-income countries. You want to create transfer. So the typical way we would think about it is the highest prices should go to those who are most at risk of deforesting. These are in some ways the groups that are I talked about good buyers. These are sort of the bad sellers, if you will. These are the ones who may be doing illegal timber sales from forests, who are already profiting from these activities. you're actually in a system that works for peers. You're going to pay much lower, or if any, prices to those who are actually good custodians of the forests. So how do we resolve, this unfairness about it? The second part is, you're going to pay landowners the equivalent of their potential profits, but you're not going to pay very often communities the cost of the fact that landowners are not going to take the land out of activities, right? So you're going to lose wages, you're going to lose taxes. Blue carbon, for instance, is entering a number of African countries in this way, and that's one of the big concerns. Landowners may sell their land without thinking about the communities. And then finally, of course, there's the big question is, how do you actually include nature-based projects and not prevent development? And this is where I think it's extremely important to think of deforestation like any other industrial activity. This is industrial act. In some ways, it is a precursor for industrial activities that low-income countries are going to do. We need to pay them for the cost of that. And then I think there are a set of issues, finally, if we ever get to the stage of an international market, how do you have what proportion of buyers and sellers from global north and global south? How do you actually account for global targets versus national targets? Can you ever pressure countries to have national targets that are determined by where we want to go on the global target? And then finally, some set of rich countries perhaps will need to be kind of not just net zero, but in terms of permit allocation, negative permits to account for that, which is hard. I think these are hard questions, but I think the good news I want to leave you all with is that I think coming up with answers requires thinking about market design and thinking about participant incentives, which I think is many people in this room excel at. So I just hope I can persuade some people to start working this. So thank you very much.
While we set up the policy panel, are there any burning questions from anyone in the room? Otherwise, yeah. So two in front, three more. So why don't you just kick off, Sue?
So I came a little late, so you may already addressed this. If you have, I explained coming in, so you may already have addressed this. If you have, you can say it's done. 30 years ago, I was at the World Bank, and there was enormous interest in carbon market. All the good country economists were working on carbon. Then interest completely just waned and then disappeared. It's coming back again. What has changed? Do we have better information? Do we have better regulation? Do we have better monitoring of what's going on?
We had a fear of worse outcomes. I think that's a lot of what's going on. But anyway, just collecting questions. So go ahead.
Yeah.
This is a question outside the field of economics, but legal scholars tell me that they're happy to give, to put penalties if someone does something bad, but they're really not comfortable with rewarding someone for not doing something bad. So just from a legal standpoint, you don't want to pay someone for not pushing the grandma down the road. So I'm just curious, how do you respond to that sort of criticism, which is outside of economics, but since our legislators are often lawyers, they often don't want to pay for someone not to push the grandma down the road.
We can come back to that. Mark?
And more at the back.
Yes, okay. I'm just going to give you your comment. So sorry, no, I want to come back a bit when you create something like the UES, because we are the behind. You need to also have capital projects. So you open the door to this.
Not right now. I think we need to have much better quality, because I think what we saw in the first phase of EU ETS was exactly, it did not work to have it.
Yeah, so why not just keep it separate?
Because I think if you keep it separate, you're going to need compliance markets at some point from it.
Yeah, but we keep it separate. What we have on Monday is more of a certain amount of reforestation or non-reforestation or whatever. But I
think I certainly would not mix them right now, but I'm happy to chat about it. I mean, as I said, I want to just open the door for us to think about these issues, and it could well be the solution is different markets, but markets with caps in all cases.
Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll set up a panel. So those who are on the panel, please come to the front. Really, what you just said was
you want to see a particular? No.
Thanks so much.
Wait, you see? What is it?
Okay. Here's for the purpose of the UK climate change.
We're going to start the public. And what I'll do is so I think the idea is that we're going to have a number of sort of pros into different areas of this market. And I wanted to introduce, first of all, the Minister of the Environment, behind us. Hello. Hello from London. Thank you for making it online. And then we have Rosalind Ajay, who's the Director of Climate Change in the Voluntary Commission of Ghana. Thank you very much for coming. Mohammed Al-Bukhari, who is the Assistant Secretary General for Planning, Ministry of Water and Irrigation, Jordan. So we're drawing from all over the world. And Chuks Chigezi, who's the IGC Director for Sierra Leone. So many thanks also for coming. And finally, a different part of the world, which is here, Piers Forster, who's the Chairman of the Climate Change Commission. So everybody here has an interest in these markets. I guess we also have an interest in making them work. So what I was going to do is sort of ask a number of questions, starting with the Minister in Sierra Leone, and then have Rahini respond after they have answered the question. So we kind of probe into these different markets. So the first sort of theme, I guess, when I look at it, sort of carbon markets and policy challenges. And I'm going to start actually with the Minister sort of talking about, being from Sierra Leone, natural asset protection, ecosystem restoration. A lot of what Rahini was talking about was in that area. So I guess what we're thinking about is sort of how a carbon finance mechanism might be structured both to protect the ecosystem of Sierra Leone and also the people who live within the forest and so on. So if you could begin with that just to kick things off. So this is sort of going into the right away into the kind of ecosystem forestry sector in Sierra Leone, but thinking about how a climate finance mechanism might actually be kind of harnessed to sort of help protect that. I'm going to sit down so people can see you on the screen. So hopefully you can see that. Thank you. So Minister, if you can begin proceedings, please.
So thank you very much, and thanks to the professor for an excellent presentation. I think she's laid it out very well. For Sierra Leone, we are looking at ecosystem restoration for multiple reasons, but the primary reason is that our ecosystems have historically provided services to communities that live close to these forests, as well as the country as a whole. Putting aside the fact that the sequestration services that these ecosystems have provided to the world free of charge for decades haven't been appreciated. What we have seen is a lot of degradation and deforestation over the years, and that has affected communities that live close to these forests. If you think about the primary services that these ecosystems provide, food, water, medicine, and especially water, which is a very, important basic commodity that we all need for life. If we don't stop the current rate of deforestation and degradation, then we have water security issues down the line that could be problematic, not just for our countries, but it could be problematic for the world as a whole. So that's why we want to do these ecosystem restoration. Carbon markets would be a way to fund the ecosystem restoration project, but that takes time. It takes time to set things up. We are currently we're working on climate legislation, and as part of that climate legislation, we will put a carbon trading framework in place to ensure that we have a robust carbon market, one that has integrity, one that people would have confidence in, investors as well as buyers of carbon credits. But we know that takes time. So right now we are looking for funding and technical capacity to start this process so that we slow down the degradation, stop the degradation, reverse that, and then as part of that entire process, promote sustainable use of these ecosystems.
Well, thank you very much. So actually, just before we proceed to Rahini, because we have folks here earlier, can you maybe kind of talk about this kind of critical issue that Rahini came to, which is how does one access these climate finance mechanisms? What are the barriers for a country like Sierra Leone for actually accessing? Because last year in the environment, we had a secretary from Pakistan who basically said we just had this massive flood. It couldn't be more incontrovertible. We suffered a huge climate disaster, and yet we cannot get hold of any climate finance. So could you just talk a little bit about the practicalities of how one might access these funds?
Yeah, so I think Professor Rooney's points around institutional dynamics are critical. So I think there are things that need to happen within the government itself, and it's pretty tough because it's a relatively new area. The minister's ministry is itself relatively new. So you've got, as he alluded there, you've got those practical capacity issues and everything else. Sierra Leone political arena is also a very contested terrain, which means you've got to really address coordination failures on a scale. And I think that there's a challenge to actually just build a consensus within the government itself. So if you take, for example, the NDCs, the National Returning Contributions, I think the last one that was, I think, 2023, if we still correct. That's setting out something like a $2.8 billion bill, which, and we know with the current economic challenges, a lot of that's going to have to be done because the indebtedness and the macroeconomic challenges and so on. So I think that sets the stage, and of course, I think next year there will be an updated one on that. So I think some of the issues are quite practical. So you've got quite a lot of donors, for example, in the space. World Bank is developing a carbon strategy. So that coordination is one key piece. I mean, I hope that as IGC, we can also help with some of these experiments that might be useful. Clearly, at the moment, the concern is that if one thinks about this as a sort of tripartite structure where you've got the state definitely staking a claim, rightly so, in this area. You've got the developers, talked about creating this market. The missing piece is the community. And community is a lot harder to address, because you're talking about heterogeneous groups. You're talking about very, very different land systems in the country, different sorts of challenges. But they, if you take, for example, those who are living in the mangrove areas, you don't have to persuade them of the importance of the mangroves, because they have seen that degradation and they have understood, they understand very clearly the value of the mangrove. So they're actually facing, water ingestion, which is actually damaging, destroying their inputs. Of course, the fish are no longer can reproduce. So there's a clear incentive there for them. But then you come to this question of, so you ask them not to cut down the mangroves, then what? Where are the alternatives? And this is, the cooking. I mean, I think the figure in Sierra Leone is that 80% of the fuels is from firewood. So it's extraordinarily high. So the clean cooking tools, cook stoves is important. So as you start looking at this, you get more and more issues, and you've got more and more government departments and government agencies that are taking this on. One of the things that the minister has mentioned, which I think is very, very interesting, is also trying to, because the political economy dynamics is also important to think about. And he's really keen to see local investors actually take an interest and perhaps to sort of boost that, which then, as a politician, enables him to have fight some battles, because you've now got local stakeholders. It's not just this alienated external project where people are flying in and out, and it all seems a bit sort of remote. So there are just a large number of things on. It's not just his plate. You've got the finance. You've got a raft of agencies. All of them in a resource-starved environment. They're all ready to fight for their little piece of the pie. And so again, that those coordination. So incentivizing the collective action is really important. And again, I want us as IGC to be thinking about what we can do in the research arena to help that process. It definitely is a case that I think in a fragile state, Sierra Leone, these things are more challenging and more accentuated.
Okay, so just a couple of things before I jump to reading. One thing is that we heard in the morning about the case of the fisheries bodies, which were then backed up to the state. So for you, Rahini, I guess we're very quickly getting into the thing called political economy, which is a bit nebulous. So how could you think of ways of directly benefiting the people that the minister referred to, you referred to, the people living in these ecosystems who have a natural inclination to protect them? How do you harness this? That was one thing. And I think one sort of facade against which you could look at that question is, if you think about the fund that was given to Indonesia and Brazil by the Norwegians, the story I've always heard in Indonesia was $1 billion. It was never ever going to be close enough to the amount of money being made in oil palm. It was just insufficient relative to the potential benefits. But more important is that it never went anywhere near the people who were living in the forest, near the forest, and hence it was deeply unpopular with that, because it essentially was seen as sort of taking away their resource, which they would have otherwise been using responsibly. So, Rahini, can you sort of focus a little bit on how do you benefit people all the place, and how to look sort of structure payments, so that there is a kind of alignment between those people and the more national fairness you represent to actually protect the ecosystem.
So I think, as I said, this is an area with many difficult questions that need to be answered, and I think you've identified some of them. I think the only I'd say is one of the ways, and maybe it's trying to start make some progress, and the state can play a role here, is to push, if you will, the brokers who are doing the trade between the project developers and the buyers to put on them requirements on a lot more on how the money is going to move down the chain. I think right now there's very little transfer things from what I can tell. And, you negotiate to get what the price will be for 1 metric ton of CO2 from this project, but there is no rules on how this should be divided in any form. That's one. I mean, the other, of course, is, if in many of these cases, the payments are going to go for, let's say, the landowners or the owners in this area, and the state can think about, how are they going to possibly tax and redistribute that to the community. But I agree, I think it's the role of the state to think about what are the requirements that are in place on these projects in terms of it feeding back to the community. The other thing I just mentioned, which I think is more an open question to me, is it feels like restoration projects, I think, are relatively more popular right now in this market, but are quite difficult to implement because they have a very long time horizon. And so I think there's a question of how much a state can push for upfront payments, so for communities, but then also what would be the mechanism to ensure that if the actions are not taking place, those payments will kind of be stopped. I think very often there's a view that you can't actually stop the payments once you start them, and so there's very little kind of ex post verification payment on the basis of it.
Right, so I think what I'd like to do is actually bring in peers, simply because I think what I want to do is to sort of go, we're in the country, now go out in the middle, and then we will come back into some of the concerns. And I think we'll sort of round out with more probing how, if ever, the kind of international markets could ever work, because that's of course the idea that there could be a trade between countries willing to offset, voluntary or not. So Piers, I guess the topic for you moving forward is, and the CCC has a domestic, Piers is the chairman. Chair of the Climate Change Committee. It had a partial domestic remit dealing with NDCs, the things that you were referring to, but also an international remit. So if we go to the international, because it's sort of pushing in that direction, how can the CCC in the UK kind of lead on, producing a more equitable, to make this market work better, to sort of deal with some of the climate finance issues that which are always the elephant in the room here, because the emissions were largely created away from many of these countries. So how can the UK, particularly CC, show some leadership in that?
Okay, well, it's excellent to be here today. So the job of the Climate Change Committee is to act as the independent advisor to the UK government so it can honour its both domestic and international climate commitments. And we did produce a report on voluntary carbon markets. We published 2 years ago, but unfortunately, things haven't changed too much in that last 2-year time frame. So if you're interested, I encourage you to download it from our website. To get to your question about what the UK can do to support this work, it is a very timely one to ask, I think, because we have a brand new government, and they're not that brand new now, they're already 100 days in, and they said they would do a lot in 100 days, but what do we see anyway? But they have committed to re-establishing the UK as an international leader within the climate change negotiations. They have already asked our committee for advice on our next NDC target that we are going to give to the government at the end of October. And if you did hear the speech by David Pammy, the Foreign Secretary, he did talk about trying to put climate and nature in the central thing for all his decisions at FCD. So that's going to be front and center of all their work. So I think that's very encouraging. And one of the key things he talked about doing with that is institutional change in the way the financial markets work, and that was right at the top of the Foreign Secretary's agenda. So I think that's encouraging. And it's good to talk about what that actually does mean. And I think we're all very aware that direct financial support from government to government is quite limited. We've struggled as an international community to develop this 100 billion goal. So they're all looking to what can the private sector deliver. So I think that will be the key to the negotiation when we get to Azerbaijan. But the government is beginning to do stuff around the voluntary carbon markets. We did instigate this transition plan task force, and the job of this transition plan task force is to really tell companies what offsets they should be buying and what activities they should be offsetting against, and when they should be deploying them. And if you look at the Financial Conduct Authority, that will hopefully report on to fake big companies in the UK to do some reporting on their overall transition to that net zero target that they've got, and it will define some of the words like net zero signs. A lot of companies purport to be net zero signed and things, but what actually is that defined as? So I think by tightening up the definitions and by producing an overall credible transition for companies where they detail the way they use offsetting within that overall journey can really benefit the whole credibility. And the key thing we want the government to do is to really support the robust negotiations around Article 6 in the COP negotiations. We have to really make it work. We have to make sure that it is robust and verifiable and much as possible. And we also have to be prepared to experiment there, try things and see what works, and be prepared to change and adapt it as we go along with the journey. And just because I think we are under increasing awareness that we have to support the whole goal to decarbonize, and we have to get our financial structures and our financial institutions to be able to support this transition as much as possible. And just to say, what we'll be doing as the Climate Change Committee is to really try and make sure the government launch consultations, but we really want to make sure the consultations work and they to effectively then get into climate policies.
Great. So I guess for you, Rahimi, just two things which came up from the Minister of Sierra Leone as well. How does one think about, so we're hearing two things. One is that a lot of the stuff in government is new, confronting these issues with a new set of challenges, the disturbance,
ministers, for many people within government. So is there a kind of a need for, and things like the climate change committee are not new, but they're relatively new within government. Is there a need for sort of new institutions within government? Well, that's one thing. And then the second thing is, internationally, you keep hearing this kind of essentially problem that the people who are verifying have an incentive not to verify something. Because they want to sell cheap offsets and so on. So where might government, or maybe the international organization, how is that verification going to be done in a way that the buyer of the credit actually believes that what they're buying is going to actually offset some carbon? Well, that seems like a sort of a crux issue, and that may be more of an international one because maybe we need an international body to verify that. So those two things seem to be pretty critical here in the previous comment. So maybe you can just say a couple of things there.
Yeah, no, thanks. I completely agree with you. And I think building on what both peers said and what our colleagues from Sierra were saying, I think there are roles that both national and I'd say kind of rich country governments can play in terms of just setting requirements. So you could very easily set requirements nationally to say that for a project to be verified, these are certain criteria that have to be satisfied by who the verifier. But even certify verifiers for a certain standard, which may not require others to become maybe more like it. A good example to think about is kind of what happened, say, after the Rana Plaza and Pakistan episode in textile, right, where a lot of international players were forced to upgrade the kind of verification auditing requirements they had. That was happened through private players, but with a lot of, I think, government pressure, and certainly in those domestic countries.
Yeah.
So I think those would be places where I think governments and regulatory bodies can play a role. I think you have to recognize that this is a voluntary market right now. It's not, what is not regulated is, let's say, who is required to enter and what they sell. But you can certainly regulate what you actually believe would be, a requirement for compliance to happen or for verification to happen. And then the other thing is, to the extent that a lot of these transfers are global transfers, international transfers, that typically gives governments both sides an ability to enter in terms of, which are the kind of, how do you prevent, I think as a low income country, you have a lot of incentives to build up reputation that projects coming to your country are high quality. That's when you bring in international climate finance. And so thinking about how you actually get there, I think they have high returns for countries, which, as you said, you need money for, say, ecosystem preservation and restoration. But the more you can actually, as a government, help set those standards of verified quality, will be very valuable.
But is there, do you see satellites and these sorts of things as being the kind of, something in part?
No, absolutely. So those things will be very valuable as measurement tools. I don't think governments necessarily are going to have the wherewithal for doing, but they can set standards of what they actually think is the requirements. And that's where, hopefully, with groups like IBC Sierra Leone, you can actually start doing, issues that come. Just to give you the example of the work we did on auditors in Gujarat, the way it came about is that the High Court in Gujarat told the regulator that they had to come up with a credible audit system, otherwise they were going to disband it. And that's when the regulator decided to approach researchers to collaborate, because they felt the court would be convinced by scientific evidence of that standard, and that's how it got adopted.
I guess on the measurement issue, the rate of improvement of monitoring is exponential. So it will be, on forest, for example, that very minute level, how much carbon it's in. So I wanted to bring in now Rosalind. And I guess you're firmly in the forestry sector, but also responsible for climate change. And I think it would be good to kind of go back into some of the existing mechanisms such as RED+, which we mentioned at various points, because that's been the sort of dominant policy mechanism. So I think the question for you is really around how has that been working for government?
How do you think it could be reformed? And then maybe picking up a little bit what the minister was saying in Sierra Leone, and Trix was saying, you know, what will it take to really open the floodgates of private finance? Because it's clear that in a place like Ghana, we have forests and other ecosystems. That would be a great thing, but I hear repeatedly it's just not happening. So, you know, some practical suggestions of your experience of how that might be happening would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a very good evening to everyone gathered here. Thank you for having Ghana and for having myself. When I saw the theme for the roundtable conversation as being a masterclass, I was wondering what is a masterclass? But really, we've had a masterclass. Thank you, Rohini. That was absolutely fantastic, covering every detail and aspect of what we are grappling with within the voluntary carbon market. Now, before I move into Ghana's experience, I just want to touch a bit on some of the things that Rohini spoke about. The fact that we are talking about these markets delivering for low and middle income countries, and they're rising up to the occasion. Question is, how much are we actually emitting? The whole of Africa is emitting about 4% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And we are at a stage where, and even that, we have a lot coming from the north of Africa. So if I go to present a proposal to my minister or to my president that let's get into this conversation of carbon emissions and markets, question is, at what expense? Because we need to also develop, and these are the realities of the market. Just recently, I was having a look at the figures for timber exports out of our country. And I realized that for 6 months, we're talking about hundreds of millions of euros. And here we are talking about keeping our trees for a market that is paying $5, $10 at most per ton. I think that the forestry sector sometimes is quite displaced, because when we talk about our emission reductions, there are so many figures. So when you multiply by $5, it becomes so much. So everybody's like, it's a lot of money. But we are not really looking at what it's going to do on the landscape and the number of people that depend on these forests. And again, thank you, Rohini, for looking at nature-based, that sector and forests. I schooled in the University of Edinburgh, and I've been to so many places. Every time there's a climate change conversation, the number one sector that normally comes up is energy. Most times you have forestry being a back burner, or you have nature-based solutions being a back burner. So to have that as a feature in your presentation, I think is phenomenal. Because what forests stand to gain, or what they stand to give us in this climate change discourse, is quite huge. Nature-based solutions, particularly for forests, are going to contribute about 1/3 of the solutions. I believe I'm talking to a lot of academia. Research has proven this. It's not just coming out of my own head, but up till now, delivering the needed finance for forests is still a challenge. And then now we have this voluntary carbon market that, in Rohini's words, I'm paraphrasing, but she mentioned that for forests, the best attempt for us is to fix this market, because it's going to deliver the finance that we need. Now, if we go back to Rohini's slides, and I'm answering my question here, when she took us through the different actors in the market, we saw the developers, then we saw the buyers, then we saw the brokers, and we saw registries. Now, in that developers box, you realize that countries were not mentioned. Now, that is something that's largely missing in this landscape, because the countries have not built the needed capacity. So we have a lot of third parties trying to think for countries that are generating emission reductions. And there's a disconnect. Now we talk about demand and supply. In this market, I think there's a reverse of demand and supply. For what I know from my little economics, supply really, demand really determines the price of supply. Now, in this market, the demand side is setting up the prices. So no private sector company is asking a poorest country, what is it taking for you to generate a ton of carbon? No, they come to the table and you're already saying, well, I'm going to offer you $5, $10. Against what?
What for, really? What analysis have you done to give me $5, $10 or $15? And every country is context specific. It might take Ghana $30 to generate a ton of carbon. It might take Sierra Leone $50. Now, even within Ghana, for particular ecosystems, because we have the high forest and then we have savanna, it might take us different efforts to generate a ton of carbon. Countries are largely being left out in this conversation because a lot of people have come in as developers, as brokers, and they are charging so much out of the transactions that they are making. Now, what we decided to do in Ghana is to build this capacity ourselves and to do this through jurisdictional RED+. So we are not just looking at project type RED+, where you have a lot of corporates or brokers or developers. We are doing jurisdictional RED+ across big areas in Ghana. And we started by building safeguards capacity. What would it mean for us socially and environmentally to accept any type of program or intervention on RED+? What would it mean for us within the MRV, measurement, reporting, verification? Rohini was talking about the forest monitoring systems that we need to set up. Of course, we're not going to mount a satellite ourselves, but we have determined if we want data in this particular format. We want data over this period, and this is what is going to help us. We have also built capacity within our institutions to respond to the needs that we have. So within the government institutions, the local communities, within our NGOs, CSOs, we have taken our time to build capacity over a period of about 10 years. It doesn't come cheap. It's very expensive. And we have now moved into the stage where we are building particularly the understanding of locals. Because the voluntary carbon market, as the name says, as Rohini mentioned, is voluntary. You have a number of people coming in. And of course, for a country like Ghana, where the land ownership has about 80% of land being owned by communities and individuals, they are at liberty to do whatever it is they want to do. One developer goes in and offers $10, $10,000 is huge. It's a huge deal for a local community member when they hear $10,000. But it could be that they could be getting $100,000. So we are building their capacity to understand this. And then we are building their capacity as an institution set up to manage funds. Now, many people talk about local communities receiving their own carbon payments. The question is, when you're receiving these payments, depending on where it is coming from, you need to be doing procurement, you need to be audited. Have we set up local communities to be audited? Do they have office spaces? Where are they keeping their files? Nobody has built this type of capacity. That's what we are also doing now. And then we're also changing the price conversation. We started from $5 with the World Bank, but now we've come to a place where I think we have about the highest price within the region for carbon with a recent deal that we had with an oil company, not just any oil company, an oil company that has a net zero strategy that we have vetted. I remember the first time we told an oil company that we want to do due diligence on your company. Their question was, what are you going to check? And we asked them, but do you want to do due diligence on a whole government organization? We are about 4,000 plus. You were just few people. What are you going to check? We also have things to check. We're checking their net zero strategy. We are checking their local content strategy. We are even checking the extent to which they can fulfill that strategy. And all that is built into the price per ton of carbon. We are not where we want to be, but at 15.5 per ton at the moment, we are at a very good place considering that we started at $5 for forest carbon credits. And moving forward, what we want to do is that we want to get into the space where I was talking about the capacity building. I was talking about changing the dynamics where the supply side is actively reflected in this market. We want to get to the space where we build the capacity of local communities to be able to do their own transactions, free of any government interference, free of elite capture at the local level. Most times we talk about elite capture at the national level. Elite capture at the local level is even more dangerous because you might find a few, excuse me to say, educated people within local communities who are fronting for them, who are their leaders, and they have so much trust in them. And so if they are leading them astray, I mean, they just lead them astray. But for government, there is already skepticism. So once we come into the picture, local communities have their antennas all high up and they'll be checking a lot more. But with their own, they might not be doing that. So that's where we are get into. So this is a story of what Ghana is doing that is reflecting a good practice that a number of other countries also in the region have come to us to learn from. And increasingly, we want to take this out there and be able to reflect strongly countries in the conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Rosamund. So for you, Rahina, I guess the big flashlight sort of jumping out of what she was saying is role of government. Right, so why, when we think about traditional development, places like the World Bank and so on, there was this sort of either national, let's say, organization, or bank that was giving money to loan to something to countries. But suddenly in this market, the foreign markets, it seems to be mainly private there. So why did that happen? And then secondly, when governments like Ghana wish to build capacity in a situation where they have, not vast amounts of resources, how do they do that? How do they get assistance with that part of it? Because it does feel like a lot of the verification, a lot of the regulation will be much more naturally achieved through government. But that seems to be, like as you were saying, a smallish player in the space. But just, I mean, to the extent you have any thoughts on that.
And how does this link up with the big funds that are being talked about, the loss and damage type funds? What is the relationship between this and the private government markets government?
Well, let me first start by just congratulating Rosalind and the Ghanaian government. I think it's absolutely amazing what you're doing and it's very needed. I think exactly what you were saying when it comes to both making people realize the value of land, but also I think how communities are going to be engaged in it. I think you need the state to play that role. I was also very interested, and we can take it offline, is to hear more about kind of where the state steps back, given it's a voluntary market, and where it actually say can regulate, especially international players coming in, given that they're international, they're working in a domestic terrain. So presumably things like land purchase and land sales, I think the Ghanaian government can presumably do something. But I think it's super exciting to hear what you're doing, and I couldn't agree more that we need to see sort of states playing a role. I think what you were saying, the International Loss and Damage Fund, which is or the Loss and Damage Fund, is seen as being all about adaptation. And something I think at least Robin and I have been talking about a bit is sort of how sometimes you try to draw this bright line between mitigation and adaptation, but something like, say, restoring ecosystems is arguably some about mitigation, but also adaptation. And I think, so while the Loss and Damage Fund would be different from VCMs, which was supposed to be adaptation, certainly a lot of what's happening through these carbon markets arguably has elements of both mitigation and adaptation. But I also suspect this is, not as America, but right now there's going to be, in at least the short run, more money available to countries through the VCM, because there are things like these tech companies trying to enter very aggressively. While I think the negotiations that are going to take place to actually get comparable amounts of money in the Loss and Damage Fund will take a while.
Great, so I think what I'd like to do now is to bring in Mohammed. And most of our discussion, in fact, all of our discussion pretty much has been focused on forest and land, the land underneath forest. Because I think you know what's beneath that could be valuable. But I think the water issue, if you do any kind of public surveys of what the big environmental concerns are, and this is going back for decades, is often water, lack of water, dirty water, etc. So, Jordan has obviously water issues.
Yes.
It'd be really interesting to think about how climate finance could help Jordan deal with those water issues, how the government's thinking about that, because it's certainly not an issue that is limited in any way to Jordan. It's an extreme case. But I think it'd be nice to sort of pivot to sort of a different, part of environmental stress and see, and just have your thoughts on
yes,
particularly on this issue which keeps repeating itself of how does one access climate finance, given that some of the deforestation, some of the droughts everywhere in Africa and Jordan are not related to the emissions that we were putting happened in those countries, that are related to emissions elsewhere. Then,
it does feel like the sort of climate finance, climate justice issue become pertinent.
Yes, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. As a starting point, the climate change is one of the challenges that the water sector is facing, and we have a big challenge under that title. We have a change in our precipitation when it comes to the rain, amount of the rain, plus the pattern of the rain, and that affect our water availability when it comes to the groundwater and surface water. And that pushed the Ministry of Water and Irrigation and the whole water sector to think of any solution to make the water available for the people. Push us to think of very expensive projects and very intensive projects when it comes to the energy consumption. That make the water sector have, I'm not saying a challenge, it's like an issue with the energy sector in Jordan. As a fact that we are the biggest consumer when it comes to the energy production in Jordan. We are consuming between 10 to 15% of the total energy in the whole country. So any change from our side, it affects the energy and affect everything attached to the energy production, as well as any change on the energy when it comes to the tariff reform on their side, affect us. And to be honest, we start to think of how can we synchronize this relationship and to make some kind of integration. And we think of having what we call it nexus, or the integration between the water and energy, adding to that at a later stage, the food and the environment. And we are still moving ahead with that setup or system. When it comes to the green climate GCF or green climate funds, we have a challenge to be honest, to approach these kind of funds. They are most of the time they are complicated. You cannot formulate a good relationship with them in an easy way. If you would like to submit a proposal, then to wait for their feedback, and they need to have, for sure they will have some comments from their side. You will redesign the proposal and submit it again. It will take another 6 to 12 months and so on. Given that we have a good relationship with bilateral coordination with different development agencies, they are moving on the ground, like GIZ, let's say, like KFW, AFD, USAID. So they are very fast when it comes to the fund security. And sometimes the government, they are focusing more on finance rather than investment. And you can understand the situation. You need to secure money at this. So most of the people, they start to confuse even the understanding of investment and finance. At the end of the day, investment is where you would like to go with your projects or the sector or something like that. So it's like strategic direction, strategic evolvement. But when it comes to the finance, it's how to secure the money for that investment. But anyway, the people, they start, or the government, they are focusing more on finance. So whether they find the finance through USAID or through the World Bank or through any development agency, very quick, they will go with that. I agree with my colleagues that the capacity building is one of the challenges that we need to enhance the capacities, because even the bilateral relationship with the development agencies, most of the time they are formulating the project by their own hands with support from the local employees. But at the end of the day, they are doing the whole design and the whole writing and everything. And it makes the people, they thought that they know everything, but sometimes they don't have the full understanding of how to formulate a bankable, full detailed project. So it's a challenge that you need to enhance the capacities in that direction for the employees of the water or the energy, whatever sectors. Again, going back to the water sector, I mean, we have many different investment pillars or investment areas that we call it strategic direction, because we have a challenge of the water availability when it comes to the ground or surface water. It push us to think to enhance non-conventional water resources. But again, these kind of options, they are very expensive. They are energy intense, and we are talking about non-conventional. We are thinking of desalination. It's far away in Jordan. You need to pump the water more than 400 kilometers to reach the cities of Jordan, and you can imagine how much energy we need to consume with that pumping. Plus the treated wastewater. We are one of the best country in the region in utilizing the treated wastewater in agricultural activities. That took a very long time to convince the people, the social acceptance and everybody. But again, it's a part right now, and eventually part of our agricultural mechanism that the people is accepting the treated wastewater to be utilized in their agricultural activities. thinking of having renewable energy is one of the strategic lines that we keep thinking of. But again, the challenge is with the energy sector, and they have their own policies, their own strategies, and they have their own understanding, and they have their own limitations. And you cannot sometimes think that you are the solo of the government. There are other players who would like to look for their own interests. So maybe the water sector, they would like to use as much as they can renewable energy to minimize the cost and to minimize the energy intense. But again, it's on the energy sector, it affects their stability and affect their capacities in transferring the energy all over the kingdom, something like that. So again, this kind of to integrate all the players together and to sit and to talk it's crucial and important, and when it comes to developing the strategies at high level. To my understanding, we should come from top to the bottom approach. Most of the people think that these kind of options or solutions, they should come from the bottom to the top. I think no, we should come from the top to the bottom. We should set our policies in a certain harmony way, then we can go to the implementation. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess one question that comes out that is sort of the issue of investment, because obviously what you hear repeatedly is the fiscal space to make big investments, say in whether it's water or make the transportation system electric, or putting renewable, big renewable energy projects in the So I guess what I was wondering about is, also water systems as well are very expensive, but they're all part of the environment. So how does one sort of think about that, the cost effectiveness, or if you're thinking about projects which don't have to be forestry, they could be renewable actually with water. How does one think about what is the sort of market discovery process by which you find the best project and choose, the kind of pricing to see you're going for the projects which are giving you the biggest emission reduction for dollar.
You're asking a very hard question, so I'm going to make a slightly sideways answer, and then maybe people in the audience will. One issue that comes up in price setting in this market is, do you price something more than just the metric ton of carbon? So you often hear people saying that we should be measuring the biodiversity gains or the water conservation gains, and that's a complicated issue to answer, because again you end up with a multiplicity of prices, some of which are more or less verifiable. So I think in the market you want only one price, but potentially what you want is in some ways, the bottom of the price to be set by these potential gains on things. And I think biodiversity is a key one that keeps coming up. So very often you look at the difference in these nature-based project prices, and people say, well, the high ones are the ones that have great biodiversity gains. So those should certainly have a price, but it's not clear that's the price of a CO2 emission unless you tie it in some kind and say this is how much more should be. So I think that's an issue I think the market has to deal with and has not dealt with yet.
Great. So I think we're nearly at time. The minister from Sierra Leone was going to come in, but feel free to say whatever you like in your sort of final words. So I give everybody a final minute. One possible thing you might talk about is sort of what is the one thing that you think would make these voluntary carbon markets work, but you don't have to talk about that. So, Minister, would you like to come in from Sierra Leone and just give your comment, please?
So thank you very much, Robin. And I've listened to a lot of very good points. And I just wanted to add a few things from our perspective in Sierra Leone. The first thing is that when it comes to these carbon projects or anything to do with ecosystem restoration, the community is at the center. The community has to benefit from it. One, from a political point of view, and two, from an economic point of view, in the sense that, you can't plant trees and tell people, to watch the trees if they're not getting any benefit from those trees. It just doesn't work. So, but in the long run, what we really want to do is democratize this process so that instead of having project managers or project developers come in to develop these projects, we have a system in place where the communities themselves can have access to these carbon markets. You know, it may sound far-fetched now, but I think the technology is there. It just takes a lot of time to put the systems in place for this to happen, where communities then can see directly how they benefit from the protection of these forests, because the benefits accrue directly to them. There is no middleman. I mean, one of the challenges now, and one of the things that we're trying to avoid, is land grabs, wherein people come in and they want massive tracts of land because they're doing carbon projects. They want to list it for 99 years. I mean, the question I always ask, I mean, are we going back to 100 to 200 years ago, wherein we have people come in and have these long leases of land? We want to make sure that the focus is on our communities, because they are the ones that, first of all, they're the custodians of the land, and they're the ones that are going to be looking after these lands. Without them, it doesn't work. Rohini mentioned that restoration takes time, and she's absolutely right. We're looking at restoration not just as an environmental intervention, but as an economic intervention. So, the restoration we're looking at as a macroeconomic intervention that gets into these communities, because to restore, you have to give these communities an economic incentive to stop the deforestation and to stop the degradation. I'll give you an example. Let's say you want to restore mangroves. A lot of the time, mangroves are being cut because they're a good source of energy, especially when, for the people in the fishing community who smoke fish. When you talk to them, they sort of understand. I mean, they understand that the mangroves are important for the fish themselves, because the mangroves provide breeding ground for the fish. Now, if you want to restore the mangroves, you need to either create alternatives for drying the fish, or create more efficient methods of drying the fish, or both. And to do that, what you're doing is not just protecting, and restoring these mangroves. You also need to plant new trees, but you also would have sort of a new industry of people who would be creating these stoves. And the goal is to have these stoves also generate carbon credits, because now you're avoiding the carbon that usually results from drying the fish. I don't know if Robin, or if any of the anyone on the panel has seen how fish is dried. You have like lots of logs that are put in. You have a 3 stone of fire, and you have a mesh on top, and it literally is a way of like destroying our forest. So you have a lot of moving pieces, and it's quite a complicated system to put together, which is why it takes time. Like you cannot rush it. You need to make sure that all the pieces are there. But at the end of the day, what's important is that the community has to be at the front of this. Benefits have to accrue to the community. Otherwise, it doesn't work. From Sierra Leone's point of view, a lot of what we're doing, or a lot of our plans, is to go to other countries, not just in the region, in the West African region, but like Ghana, but countries on the continent, learn what they've done, learn from the good things, the good experiences that they have, but also learn from mistakes that they have made, to build up our system. And I think collectively, we can, over the next couple of years, build something where our people can benefit from the carbon markets, while at the same time protecting these ecosystems and benefiting from the ecosystem services that they provide. I know a lot of has been said about the pricing of carbon and how that would stimulate bring better benefits to people in these communities. I mean, the reality is that I think some of this mispricing is deliberate. Now we're talking about pricing, but we've had decades, if not centuries, throughout industrialization, where we were not even having a conversation about pricing. Our forests were providing ecosystem services free of charge, and that was that. The fact that we're talking about pricing now is actually progress. What we need to now focus, and what we, as a country, when we go into negotiations at these conference of parties, we want the pricing to actually reflect the value that is being provided. It makes no, I mean, if I am selling a car at $50 when it costs me $80 to produce that car, I'm not going to be in business for a long time.
Yeah.
Like, that's just simple economics. And, people might think that these communities in these remote areas are, backwards or illiterate. They understand the economics. Like, if it doesn't make sense for them, you're not going to have any forest or any nature-based solution that survives the test of time. So, we as a government, because, as a government, we are sort of the gatekeeper. Our interests are the people's interests, or vice versa. We are the ones that have to look out for our people that are in these remote areas that don't have the voice. We are the ones that have to make sure that we go out there, we get the best pricing for carbon. We are the ones that have to make sure that the benefit sharing agreements should be skewed in their favor, because these assets belong to them, and they are the ones that we should be seeking to maximize the benefits that they get. It shouldn't be the other way around, wherein the developer comes in and thinks that they're doing a favor to the community. It should be that the community is maximizing the benefits, and the benefit sharing is skewed towards them. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about. These are some of the ways that we're hoping to bring the benefits to these communities, because for us, as these markets, or the access to these markets is not it's not relevant if it doesn't bring benefits to the people in these communities.
Thank you very much, Minister. That's a fantastic way to round out the session. I think, given the time, I would suggest we're about to go and huddle in different groups. So I just had two announcements. One is that in roughly 10 minutes, at 5:15, there's going to be in the bean counter, which is on the basement of this building, desks manned by IGC country economists of all the countries in Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. And really, those desks are about project generation. So the kind of defining feature of Environment Week is this sort of bringing together, as Rahina said at the beginning of the lecture, of both policymakers and researchers. So if you're interested in anything about the environment in these countries, go downstairs, talk to the policymakers that hear from these countries, and see if there's some common interest where you can start a project. I mean, you may not think that now, but just go and have a look. It's sort of a speed dating thing. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I'm going to open a note, which there's so many different things going on here, is that we have, this was the first of a number, and again, I'm speaking primarily to the many PhD students here and junior faculty who are interested in starting projects. I think we're going to have another 3 more master lectures. So tomorrow we have Claire Belboni, Catherine Wagner talking about financing natural disaster financing and insurance. So that's a whole different sector of work, which is important everywhere now. And we'll have a policy panel attached to that. So please, keep coming to these things. They're a way of learning about the subject matter. And then on, I guess on Wednesday, we have Harold Prattenleer and Sam Courtney, also from Yale, who's going to talk about trade in the environment, again, with a policy panel attached. And again, this is about surfacing the issues in those areas. In this case, one big one from the sort of the side of the EU is on the CBAM thing, because in 3 countries. And then finally, on Thursday, we have the great Rocco here, Machiavello, and Bob Gibbons from MIT talking about organizational environment. That's sort of thinking about how organizational economics and environmental economics overlap. So I think, just coming to this room 104 and hearing about this stuff and hearing the policymakers is really valuable, sort of jumping outside of your normal sort of paper focused business. And I think it's also hopefully valuable for the policymakers in terms of having interesting projects come to their countries from world qualified. Anyway, thank you so much for the panel. Thank you so much.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I
really love that. I've been really excited about the sexual medical. Really special.
It sounds like
Really, just the way you explain it, that's like. So. Okay. Talking about.
Okay.
Project, and I was always talking about jurisdictional level, so
It really does solve a lot of the issues.
I worked in Guyana for like 30 years.
Okay.
Level methods.
Okay.
It was a nice class, like, you would never find this way out of jurisdictions. You don't have the history to the government, right? That's the money, the government.